Book the Second, Chapter 7 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Armadale by Wilkie Collins, Chapter 7. The plot thickens. 2 messages were waiting for Allan when he returned to the house. One had been left by Midwinter. He had gone out for a long walk, and Mr. Armadale was not to be alarmed if he did not get back till late in the day. The other message had been left by a person from Mr. Pedgift's office, who had called, according to appointment, while the 2 gentlemen were away at the major's. Mr. Bashwood's respects, and he would have the honour of waiting on Mr. Armadale again in the course of the evening. Toward 5 o'clock Midwinter returned, pale and silent. Allan hastened to assure him that his peace was made at the cottage, and then, to change the subject, mentioned Mr. Bashwood's message. Midwinter's mind was so preoccupied, or so languid, that he hardly seemed to remember the name. Allan was obliged to remind him that Bashwood was the elderly clerk, whom Mr. Pedgift had sent to be his instructor in the duties of the steward's office. He listened without making any remark, and withdrew to his room, to rest till dinner time. Left by himself, Allan went into the library, to try if he could while away the time over a book. He took many volumes off the shelves, and put a few of them back again, and there he ended. Miss Milroy contrived in some mysterious manner to get in this case between the reader and the books. Her formal bow and her merciless parting speech dwelt, try how he might to forget them, on Allan's mind. He began to grow more and more anxious as the idle hour wore on, to recover his lost place in her favour. To call again that day at the cottage, and ask if he had been so unfortunate as to offend her, was impossible. To put the question in writing with the needful nicety of expression proved, on trying the experiment, to be a task beyond his literary reach. After a turn or 2 up and down the room, with his pen in his mouth, he decided on the more diplomatic course, which happened in this case to be the easiest course too, of writing to Miss Milroy as cordially as if nothing had happened, and of testing his position in her good graces by the answer that she sent him back. An invitation of some kind, including her father of course, but addressed directly to herself, was plainly the right thing to oblige her to send a written reply. But here the difficulty occurred of what the invitation was to be. A ball was not to be thought of, in his present position with the resident gentry. A dinner party, with no indispensable elderly lady on the premises to receive Miss Milroy, except Mrs. Gripper, who could only receive her in the kitchen, was equally out of the question. What was the invitation to be? Never backward when he wanted help, in asking for it right and left in every available direction, Allan, feeling himself at the end of his own resources, coolly rang the bell, and astonished the servant who answered it by inquiring how the late family at Thorpe Ambrose used to amuse themselves, and what sort of invitations they were in the habit of sending to their friends. "The family did what the rest of the gentry did, sir," said the man, staring at his master in utter bewilderment. "They gave dinner parties and balls; and in fine summer weather, sir, like this, they sometimes had lawn parties and picnics." "That'll do!" shouted Allan. "A picnic's just the thing to please her. Richard, you're an invaluable man. You may go downstairs again." Richard retired wondering, and Richard's master seized his ready pen. "Dear Miss Milroy, since I left you, it has suddenly struck me that we might have a picnic. A little change and amusement, what I should call a good shaking up, if I wasn't writing to a young lady, is just the thing for you, after being so long indoors lately in Mrs. Milroy's room. A picnic is a change, and, when the wine is good, amusement too. Will you ask the Major if he will consent to the picnic, and come? And if you've got any friends in the neighbourhood who like a picnic, pray ask them too, for I have got none. It shall be your picnic, but I will provide everything, and take everybody. You shall choose the day, and we will picnic where you like. I have set my heart on this picnic. Believe me ever yours, Allan Armadale. On reading over his composition before sealing it up, Allan frankly acknowledged to himself, this time, that it was not quite faultless. "Picnic comes in a little too often," he said. "Never mind. If she likes the idea, she won't quarrel with that." He sent off the letter on the spot, with strict instructions to the messenger to wait for a reply. In half an hour the answer came back on scented paper, without an erasure anywhere, fragrant to smell and beautiful to see. The presentation of the naked truth is one of those exhibitions from which the native delicacy of the female mind seems instinctively to revolt. Never were the tables turned more completely than they were now turned on Allan by his fair correspondent. Machiavelli himself would never have suspected, from Miss Milroy's letter, how heartily she had repented her petulance to the young squire as soon as his back was turned, and how extravagantly delighted she was when his invitation was placed in her hands. Her letter was the composition of a model young lady whose emotions are all kept under parental lock and key, and served out for her judiciously as occasion may require. "Papa" appeared quite as frequently in Miss Milroy's reply as "picnic" had appeared in Allan's invitation. Papa had been as considerately kind as Mr. Armadale in wishing to procure her a little change and amusement, and had offered to forego his usual quiet habits and join the picnic. With papa's sanction, therefore, she accepted with much pleasure Mr. Armadale's proposal, and at papa's suggestion she would presume on Mr. Armadale's kindness to add 2 friends of theirs recently settled at Thorpe Ambrose to the picnic party, a widow lady and her son, the latter in holy orders and in delicate health. If Tuesday next would suit Mr. Armadale, Tuesday next would suit papa, being the first day he could spare from repairs which were required by his clock. The rest, by papa's advice, she would beg to leave entirely in Mr. Armadale's hands, and in the meantime she would remain, with papa's compliments, Mr. Armadale's truly Eleanor Milroy. Who would ever have supposed that the writer of that letter had jumped for joy when Allan's invitation arrived? Who would ever have suspected that there was an entry already in Miss Milroy's diary, under that day's date, to this effect: "The sweetest, dearest letter from I know who. I'll never behave unkindly to him again as long as I live." As for Allan, he was charmed with the sweet success of his manoeuvre. Miss Milroy had accepted his invitation. Consequently, Miss Milroy was not offended with him. It was on the tip of his tongue to mention the correspondence to his friend when they met at dinner, but there was something in Midwinter's face and manner, even plain enough for Allan to see, which warned him to wait a little before he said anything to revive the painful subject of their visit to the cottage. By common consent they both avoided all topics connected with Thorpe Ambrose, not even the visit from Mr. Bashwood, which was to come with the evening, being referred to by either of them. All through the dinner they drifted further and further back into the old endless talk of past times about ships and sailing. When the butler withdrew from his attendance at table, he came downstairs with a nautical problem on his mind, and asked his fellow servants if they any of them knew the relative merits, on a wind and off a wind, of a schooner and a brig. The 2 young men had sat longer at table than usual that day. When they went out into the garden with their cigars, the summer twilight fell grey and dim on lawn and flower bed, and narrowed round them by slow degrees the softly fading circle of the distant view. The dew was heavy, and after a few minutes in the garden they agreed to go back to the drier ground on the drive in front of the house. They were close to the turning which led into the shrubbery, when there suddenly glided out on them, from behind the foliage, a softly stepping black figure, a shadow moving darkly through the dim evening light. Midwinter started back at the sight of it, and even the less finely strung nerves of his friend were shaken for the moment. "Who the devil are you?" cried Allan. The figure bared its head in the grey light, and came slowly a step nearer. Midwinter advanced a step on his side, and looked closer. It was the man of the timid manners and the mourning garments, of whom he had asked the way to Thorpe Ambrose, where the 3 roads met. Who are you?" repeated Allan. "I humbly beg your pardon, sir," faltered the stranger, stepping back again confusedly. "The servants told me I should find Mr. Armadale." "What, are you Mr. Bashwood?" "Yes, if you please, sir." "I beg your pardon for speaking to you so roughly," said Allan, "but the fact is you rather startled me. My name is Armadale. Put on your hat, pray. And this is my friend, Mr. Midwinter, who wants your help in the steward's office." "We hardly stand in need of an introduction," said Midwinter. "I met Mr. Bashwood out walking a few days since, and he was kind enough to direct me when I had lost my way." "Put on your hat," reiterated Allan, as Mr. Bashwood, still bareheaded, stood bowing speechlessly, now to one of the young men, and now to the other. "My good sir, put on your hat, and let me show you the way back to the house. Excuse me for noticing it," added Allan, as the man, in sheer nervous helplessness, let his hat fall, instead of putting it back on his head, "but you seem a little out of sorts. A glass of good wine will do you no harm before you and my friend come to business. Whereabouts did you meet with Mr. Bashwood, Midwinter, when you lost your way?" "I am too ignorant of the neighbourhood to know. I must refer you to Mr. Bashwood." "Come, tell us where it was," said Allan, trying, a little too abruptly, to set the man at his ease, as they all three walked back to the house. The measure of Mr. Bashwood's constitutional timidity seemed to be filled to the brim by the loudness of Allan's voice and the bluntness of Allan's request. He ran over in the same feeble flow of words with which he had deluged Midwinter on the occasion when they first met. "It was on the road, sir," he began, addressing himself alternately to Allan, whom he called "sir," and to Midwinter, whom he called by his name. "I mean, if you please, on the road to Little Gilbeck. A singular name, Mr. Midwinter, and a singular place. I don't mean the village, I mean the neighbourhood. I mean the Broads, beyond the neighbourhood. Perhaps you may have heard of the Norfolk Broads, sir. What they call lakes in other parts of England they call Broads here. The Broads are quite numerous. I think they would repay a visit. You would have seen the first of them, Mr. Midwinter, if you had walked on a few miles from where I had the honour of meeting you. Remarkably numerous, the Broads, sir, situated between this and the sea. About 3 miles from the sea, Mr. Midwinter, about 3 miles. Mostly shallow, sir, with rivers running between them. Beautiful, solitary, quite a watery country, Mr. Midwinter, quite separate, as it were, in itself. Parties sometimes visit them, sir, pleasure parties in boats. It's quite a little network of lakes, or perhaps more correctly, pools. There is good sport in the cold weather. The wild fowl are quite numerous. Yes, the Broads would repay a visit, Mr. Midwinter, the next time you are walking that way. The distance from here to Little Gilbeck, and then from Little Gilbeck to Girdler Broad, which is the first you come to, is altogether not more..." In sheer nervous inability to leave off, he would apparently have gone on talking of the Norfolk Broads for the rest of the evening, if one of his two listeners had not unceremoniously cut him short before he could find his way into a new sentence. "Are the Broads within an easy day's drive there and back from this house?" asked Allan, feeling, if they were, that the place for the picnic was discovered already. "Oh, yes, sir, a nice drive. Quite a nice easy drive from this beautiful place." They were by this time ascending the portico steps, Allan leading the way up, and calling to Midwinter and Mr. Bashwood to follow him into the library, where there was a lighted lamp. In the interval which elapsed before the wine made its appearance, Midwinter looked at his chance acquaintance of the high road with strangely mingled feelings of compassion and distrust. Of compassion that strengthened in spite of him, of distrust that persisted in diminishing, try as he might to encourage it to grow. There, perched comfortless on the edge of his chair, sat the poor broken down nervous wretch, in his worn black garments, with his watery eyes, his honest old outspoken wig, his miserable mohair stalk, and his false teeth that were incapable of deceiving anybody. There he sat, politely ill at ease, now shrinking in the glare of the lamp, now wincing under the shock of Allan's sturdy voice. A man with the wrinkles of 60 years in his face, and the manners of a child in the presence of strangers. An object of pity, surely, if ever there was a pitiable object yet. "Whatever else you're afraid of, Mr. Bashwood," cried Allan, pouring out a glass of wine, "don't be afraid of that. There isn't a headache in a hogshead of it. Make yourself comfortable. I'll leave you and Mr. Midwinter to talk your business over by yourselves. It's all in Mr. Midwinter's hands. He acts for me, and settles everything at his own discretion." He said those words with a cautious choice of expression very uncharacteristic of him, and without further explanation made abruptly for the door. Midwinter, sitting near it, noticed his face as he went out. Easy as the way was into Allan's favour, Mr. Bashwood, beyond all kind of doubt, had, in some unaccountable manner, failed to find it. The two strangely assorted companions were left together, parted widely, as it seemed on the surface, from any possible interchange of sympathy, drawn invisibly one to the other, nevertheless, by those magnetic similarities of temperament which overleap all difference of age or station, and defy all apparent incongruities of mind and character. From the moment when Allan left the room, the hidden influence that works in darkness began slowly to draw the two men together across the great social desert which had lain between them up to this day. Midwinter was the first to approach the subject of the interview. "May I ask," he began, "if you have been made acquainted with my position here, and if you know why it is that I require your assistance?" Mr. Bashwood, still hesitating and still timid, but manifestly relieved by Allan's departure, sat further back in his chair, and ventured on fortifying himself with a modest little sip of wine. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Mr. Pedgift informed me of all. At least I think I may say so, of all the circumstances. I am to instruct, or perhaps I ought to say to advise. No, Mr. Bashwood, the first word was the best word of the two. I am quite ignorant of the duties which Mr. Armadale's kindness has induced him to entrust to me. If I understand right, there can be no question of your capacity to instruct me, for you once filled a steward's situation yourself. May I inquire where it was?" "At Sir John Mellowship's, sir, in West Norfolk. Perhaps you would like I have got it with me to see my testimonial? Sir John might have dealt more kindly with me, but I have no complaint to make. It's all done and over now." His watery eyes looked more watery still, and the trembling in his hands spread to his lips as he produced an old dingy letter from his pocket book and laid it open on the table. The testimonial was very briefly and very coldly expressed, but it was conclusive as far as it went. Sir John considered it only right to say that he had no complaint to make of any want of capacity or integrity in his steward. If Mr. Bashwood's domestic position had been compatible with the continued performance of his duties on the estate, Sir John would have been glad to keep him. As it was, embarrassments caused by the state of Mr. Bashwood's personal affairs had rendered it undesirable that he should continue in Sir John's service, and on that ground, and that only, his employer and he had parted. Such was Sir John's testimony to Mr. Bashwood's character. As Midwinter read the last lines, he thought of another testimonial, still in his own possession, of the written character which they had given him at the school, when they turned their sick usher adrift in the world. His superstition, distrusting all new events and all new faces at Thorpe Ambrose, still doubted the man before him as obstinately as ever. But when he now tried to put those doubts into words, his heart upbraided him, and he laid the letter on the table in silence. The sudden pause in the conversation appeared to startle Mr. Bashwood. He comforted himself with another little sip of wine, and, leaving the letter untouched, burst irrepressibly into words, as if the silence was quite unendurable to him. "I am ready to answer any question, sir," he began. "Mr. Pedgift told me that I must answer questions, because I was applying for a place of trust. Mr. Pedgift said neither you nor Mr. Armadale was likely to think the testimonial sufficient of itself. Sir John doesn't say he might have put it more kindly, but I don't complain. Sir John doesn't say what the troubles were that lost me my place. Perhaps you might wish to know—" He stopped confusedly, looked at the testimonial, and said no more. "If no interests but mine were concerned in the matter," rejoined Midwinter, "the testimonial would, I assure you, be quite enough to satisfy me. But while I am learning my new duties, the person who teaches me will be really and truly the steward of my friend's estate. I am very unwilling to ask you to speak on what may be a painful subject, and I am sadly inexperienced in putting such questions as I ought to put. But perhaps, in Mr. Armadale's interests, I ought to know something more, either from yourself or from Mr. Pedgift, if you prefer it." He too stopped confusedly, looked at the testimonial, and said no more. There was another moment of silence. The night was warm, and Mr. Bashwood, among his other misfortunes, had the deplorable infirmity of perspiring in the palms of the hands. He took out a miserable little cotton pocket handkerchief, rolled it up into a ball, and softly dabbed it to and fro, from one hand to the other, with the regularity of a pendulum. Performed by other men, under other circumstances, the action might have been ridiculous. Performed by this man at the crisis of the interview, the action was horrible. "Mr. Pedgift's time is too valuable, sir, to be wasted on me," he said. "I will mention what ought to be mentioned myself, if you will please to allow me. I have been unfortunate in my family. It is very hard to bear, though it seems not much to tell. My wife—" One of his hands closed fast on the pocket handkerchief. He moistened his dry lips, struggled with himself, and went on. "My wife, sir," he resumed, "stood a little in my way. She did me, I am afraid I must confess, some injury with Sir John. Soon after I got the steward's situation, she fell into habits, I hardly know how to say it, of drinking. I couldn't break her of it, and I couldn't always conceal it from Sir John's knowledge. She broke out and tried his patience once or twice when he came to my office on business. Sir John excused it, not very kindly, but still he excused it. I don't complain of Sir John. I don't complain now of my wife." He pointed a trembling finger at his miserable crape-covered beaver hat on the floor. "I'm in mourning for her," he said faintly. "She died nearly a year ago, in the country asylum here." His mouth began to work convulsively. He took up the glass of wine at his side, and instead of sipping it this time, drained it to the bottom. "I'm not much used to wine, sir," he said, conscious apparently of the flush that flew into his face as he drank, and still observant of the obligations of politeness amid all the misery of the recollections that he was calling up. "I beg, Mr. Bashwood, you will not distress yourself by telling me any more," said Midwinter, recoiling from any further sanction on his part of a disclosure which had already bared the sorrows of the unhappy man before him to the quick. "I'm much obliged to you, sir," replied Mr. Bashwood; "but if I don't detain you too long, and if you will please to remember that Mr. Pedgift's directions to me were very particular, and besides, I only mentioned my late wife because if she hadn't tried Sir John's patience to begin with, things might have turned out differently." He paused, gave up the disjointed sentence in which he had involved himself, and tried another. "I had only 2 children, sir," he went on, advancing to a new point in his narrative, "a boy and a girl. The girl died when she was a baby. My son lived to grow up, and it was my son who lost me my place. I did my best for him. I got him into a respectable office in London. They wouldn't take him without security. I'm afraid it was imprudent, but I had no rich friends to help me, and I became security. My boy turned out badly, sir. Perhaps you will kindly understand what I mean, if I say he behaved dishonestly. His employers consented, at my entreaty, to let him off without prosecuting. I begged very hard. I was fond of my son James, and I took him home, and did my best to reform him. He wouldn't stay with me. He went away again to London. I beg your pardon, sir. I'm afraid I'm confusing things. I'm afraid I'm wandering from the point." "No, no," said Midwinter, kindly. "If you think it right to tell me this sad story, tell it in your own way. Have you seen your son since he left you to go to London?" "No, sir. He's in London still, for all I know. When I last heard of him, he was getting his bread, not very creditably. He was employed, under the inspector, at the Private Inquiry Office in Shadyside Place." He spoke those words, apparently, as events then stood, the most irrelevant to the matter in hand that had yet escaped him, actually, as events were soon to be, the most vitally important that he had uttered yet. He spoke those words absently, looking about him in confusion, and trying vainly to recover the lost thread of his narrative. Midwinter compassionately helped him. "You were telling me," he said, "that your son had been the cause of your losing your place. How did that happen?" "In this way, sir," said Mr. Bashwood, getting back again excitedly into the right train of thought. "His employers consented to let him off, but they came down on his security, and I was the man. I suppose they were not to blame; the security covered their loss. I couldn't pay it all out of my savings. I had to borrow. On the word of a man, sir, I couldn't help it. I had to borrow. My creditor pressed me. It seemed cruel, but if he wanted the money, I suppose it was only just. I was sold out of house and home. I dare say other gentlemen would have said what Sir John said. I dare say most people would have refused to keep a steward who had had the bailiffs after him, and his furniture sold in the neighbourhood. That was how it ended, Mr. Midwinter. I needn't detain you any longer. Here is Sir John's address, if you wish to apply to him." Midwinter generously refused to receive the address. "Thank you kindly, sir," said Mr. Bashwood, getting tremulously on his legs. "There is nothing more, I think, except that Mr. Pedgift will speak for me, if you wish to inquire into my conduct in his service. I'm very much indebted to Mr. Pedgift. He's a little rough with me sometimes, but if he hadn't taken me into his office, I think I should have gone to the workhouse when I left Sir John. I was so broken down." He picked up his dingy old hat from the floor. "I won't intrude any longer, sir. I shall be happy to call again if you wish to have time to consider before you decide." "I want no time to consider after what you have told me," replied Midwinter warmly, his memory busy, while he spoke, with the time when he had told his story to Mr. Brock, and was waiting for a generous word in return, as the man before him was waiting now. "To-day is Saturday," he went on. "Can you come and give me my first lesson on Monday morning? I beg your pardon," he added, interrupting Mr. Bashwood's profuse expressions of acknowledgment, and stopping him on his way out of the room. "There is one thing we ought to settle, ought we not? We haven't spoken yet about your own interest in this matter. I mean about the terms." He referred, a little confusedly, to the pecuniary part of the subject. Mr. Bashwood, getting nearer and nearer to the door, answered him more confusedly still. "Anything, sir, anything you think right. I won't intrude any longer. I'll leave it to you and Mr. Armadale." "I will send for Mr. Armadale if you like," said Midwinter, following him into the hall. "But I am afraid he has as little experience in matters of this kind as I have. Perhaps, if you see no objection, we might be guided by Mr. Pedgift?" Mr. Bashwood caught eagerly at the last suggestion, pushing his retreat while he spoke as far as the front door. "Yes, sir. Oh, yes, yes. Nobody better than Mr. Pedgift. Pray don't disturb Mr. Armadale." His watery eyes looked quite wild with nervous alarm, as he turned round for a moment in the light of the hall lamp to make that polite request. If sending for Allan had been equivalent to unchaining a ferocious watchdog, Mr. Bashwood could hardly have been more anxious to stop the proceeding. "I wish you kindly good evening, sir," he went on, getting out to the steps. "I'm much obliged to you. I will be scrupulously punctual on Monday morning, I hope. I'm sure you will soon learn everything I can teach you. It's not difficult. Oh dear, no, not difficult at all. I wish you kindly good evening, sir. A beautiful night, yes, indeed, a beautiful night for a walk home." With those words all dropping out of his lips one on the top of the other, and without noticing, in his agony of embarrassment at effecting his departure, Midwinter's outstretched hand, he went noiselessly down the steps, and was lost in the darkness of the night. As Midwinter turned to re-enter the house, the dining-room door opened, and his friend met him in the hall. "Has Mr. Bashwood gone?" asked Allan. "He has gone," replied Midwinter, "after telling me a very sad story, and leaving me a little ashamed of myself for having doubted him without any just cause. I have arranged that he is to give me my first lesson in the steward's office on Monday morning." "All right," said Allan. "You needn't be afraid, old boy, of my interrupting you over your studies." "I dare say I'm wrong, but I don't like Mr. Bashwood." "I dare say I'm wrong," retorted the other a little petulantly. "I do." The Sunday morning found Midwinter in the park, waiting to intercept the postman, on the chance of his bringing more news from Mr. Brock. At the customary hour the man made his appearance, and placed the expected letter in Midwinter's hands. He opened it, far away from all fear of observation this time, and read these lines: "My dear Midwinter, I write more for the purpose of quieting your anxiety than because I have anything definite to say. In my last hurried letter I had no time to tell you that the elder of the two women whom I met in the gardens had followed me and spoken to me in the street. I believe I may characterize what she said, without doing her any injustice, as a tissue of falsehoods from beginning to end. At any rate, she confirmed me in the suspicion that some underhand proceeding is on foot, of which Allan is destined to be the victim, and that the prime mover in the conspiracy is the vile woman who helped his mother's marriage, and who hastened his mother's death. Feeling this conviction, I have not hesitated to do, for Allan's sake, what I would have done for no other creature in the world. I have left my hotel, and have installed myself, with my old servant Robert, in a house opposite the house to which I traced the two women. We are alternately on the watch, quite unsuspected, I am certain, by the people opposite, day and night. All my feelings as a gentleman and a clergyman revolt from such an occupation as I am now engaged in, but there is no other choice. I must either do this violence to my own self-respect, or I must leave Allan, with his easy nature and in his assailable position, to defend himself against a wretch who is prepared, I firmly believe, to take the most unscrupulous advantage of his weakness and his youth. His mother's dying entreaty has never left my memory, and, God help me, I am now degrading myself in my own eyes in consequence. There has been some reward already for the sacrifice. This day, Saturday, I have gained an immense advantage. I have at last seen the woman's face. She went out with her veil down as before, and Robert kept her in view, having my instructions, if she returned to the house, not to follow her back to the door. She did return to the house, and the result of my precaution was, as I had expected, to throw her off her guard. I saw her face unveiled at the window, and afterward again in the balcony. If any occasion should arise for describing her particularly, you shall have the description. At present, I need only say that she looks the full age, 35, at which you estimated her, and that she is by no means so handsome a woman as I had, I hardly know why, expected to see. This is all I can now tell you. If nothing more happens by Monday or Tuesday next, I shall have no choice but to apply to my lawyers for assistance, though I am most unwilling to trust this delicate and dangerous matter in other hands than mine. Setting my own feelings, however, out of the question, the business which has been the cause of my journey to London is too important to be trifled with much longer, as I am trifling with it now. In any and every case, depend on my keeping you informed of the progress of events, and believe me yours truly, Decimus Brock. Midwinter secured the letter as he had secured the letter that preceded it, side by side in his pocket-book with the narrative of Allan's dream. How many days more? He asked himself as he went back to the house. How many days more? Not many. The time he was waiting for was a time close at hand. Monday came, and brought Mr. Bashwood, punctual to the appointed hour. Monday came, and found Allan immersed in his preparations for the picnic. He held a series of interviews, at home and abroad, all through the day. He transacted business with Mrs. Gripper, with the butler, and with the coachman, in their 3 several departments of eating, drinking, and driving. He went to the town to consult his professional advisers on the subject of the Broads, and to invite both the lawyers, father and son, in the absence of anybody else in the neighbourhood whom he could ask, to join the picnic. Pedgift Senior, in his department, supplied general information, but begged to be excused from appearing at the picnic, on the score of business engagements. Pedgift Junior, in his department, added all the details, and, casting business engagements to the winds, accepted the invitation with the greatest pleasure. Returning from the lawyer's office, Allan's next proceeding was to go to the Major's cottage and obtain Miss Milroy's approval of the proposed locality for the pleasure party. This object accomplished, he returned to his own house, to meet the last difficulty now left to encounter, the difficulty of persuading Midwinter to join the expedition to the Broads. On first broaching the subject, Allan found his friend impenetrably resolute to remain at home. Midwinter's natural reluctance to meet the Major and his daughter after what had happened at the cottage might probably have been overcome; but Midwinter's determination not to allow Mr. Bashwood's course of instruction to be interrupted was proof against every effort that could be made to shake it. After exerting his influence to the utmost, Allan was obliged to remain contented with a compromise. Midwinter promised, not very willingly, to join the party toward evening, at the place appointed for a gipsy tea-making, which was to close the proceedings of the day. To this extent he would consent to take the opportunity of placing himself on a friendly footing with the Milroys. More he could not concede, even to Allan's persuasion, and for more it would be useless to ask. The day of the picnic came. The lovely morning and the cheerful bustle of preparation for the expedition failed entirely to tempt Midwinter into altering his resolution. At the regular hour he left the breakfast table to join Mr. Bashwood in the steward's office. The two were quietly closeted over the books at the back of the house, while the packing for the picnic went on in front. Young Pedgift, short in stature, smart in costume, and self-reliant in manner, arrived some little time before the hour for starting, to revise all the arrangements, and to make any final improvements which his local knowledge might suggest. Allan and he were still busy in consultation when the first hitch occurred in the proceedings. The woman servant from the cottage was reported to be waiting below for an answer to a note from her young mistress, which was placed in Allan's hands. On this occasion Miss Milroy's emotions had apparently got the better of her sense of propriety. The tone of the letter was feverish, and the handwriting wandered crookedly up and down in deplorable freedom from all proper restraint. "Oh, Mr. Armadale," wrote the Major's daughter, "such a misfortune! What are we to do? Papa has got a letter from Grandmamma this morning about the new governess. Her reference has answered all the questions, and she's ready to come at the shortest notice. Grandmamma thinks how provoking! The sooner the better, and she says we may expect her, I mean the governess, either to-day or to-morrow. Papa says he will be so absurdly considerate to everybody that we can't allow Miss Gwilt to come here, if she comes to-day, and find nobody at home to receive her. What is to be done? I am ready to cry with vexation. I have got the worst possible impression, though Grandmamma says she is a charming person, of Miss Gwilt. Can you suggest something, dear Mr. Armadale? I'm sure Papa would give way if you could. Don't stop to write. Send me a message back. I have got a new hat for the picnic, and oh, the agony of not knowing whether I am to keep it on or take it off. Yours truly, E. M." "The devil take Miss Gwilt!" said Allan, staring at his legal adviser in a state of helpless consternation. "With all my heart, sir. I don't wish to interfere," remarked Pedgift Junior. "May I ask what's the matter?" Allan told him. Mr. Pedgift the younger might have his faults, but a want of quickness of resource was not among them. "There's a way out of the difficulty, Mr. Armadale," he said. "If the governess comes to day, let's have her at the picnic." Allan's eyes opened wide in astonishment. "All the horses and carriages in the Thorpe Ambrose stables are not wanted for this small party of ours," proceeded Pedgift Junior. "Of course not. Very good. If Miss Gwilt comes to day, she can't possibly get here before 5 o'clock. Good again. You order an open carriage to be waiting at the major's door at that time, Mr. Armadale, and I'll give the man his directions where to drive to. When the governess comes to the cottage, let her find a nice little note of apology, along with the cold fowl or whatever else they give her after her journey, begging her to join us at the picnic, and putting a carriage at her own sole disposal to take her there. Gad, sir," said young Pedgift gaily, "she must be a touchy one, if she thinks herself neglected after that." "Capital!" cried Allan. "She shall have every attention. I'll give her the pony chaise and the white harness, and she shall drive herself if she likes." He scribbled a line to relieve Miss Milroy's apprehensions, and gave necessary orders for the pony chaise. 10 minutes later, the carriages for the pleasure party were at the door. "Now we've taken all this trouble about her," said Allan, reverting to the governess as they left the house, "I wonder, if she does come to day, whether we shall see her at the picnic." "Depends entirely on her age, sir," remarked young Pedgift, pronouncing judgment with the happy confidence in himself which eminently distinguished him. "If she's an old one, she'll be knocked up with the journey, and she'll stick to the cold fowl and the cottage. If she's a young one, either I know nothing of women, or the pony in the white harness will bring her to the picnic." They started for the major's cottage. Chapter 8. Book the Second, Chapter 8 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 8. The Norfolk Broads. The little group gathered together in Major Milroy's parlour to wait for the carriages from Thorpe Ambrose would hardly have conveyed the idea, to any previously uninstructed person introduced among them, of a party assembled in expectation of a picnic. They were almost dull enough, as far as outward appearances went, to have been a party assembled in expectation of a marriage. Even Miss Milroy herself, though conscious of looking her best in her bright muslin dress and her gaily feathered new hat, was at this inauspicious moment Miss Milroy under a cloud. Although Allan's note had assured her, in Allan's strongest language, that the one great object of reconciling the governess's arrival with the celebration of the picnic was an object achieved, the doubt still remained whether the plan proposed, whatever it might be, would meet with her father's approval. In a word, Miss Milroy declined to feel sure of her day's pleasure until the carriage made its appearance and took her from the door. The Major, on his side, arrayed for the festive occasion in a tight blue frock coat which he had not worn for years, and threatened with a whole long day of separation from his old friend and comrade the clock, was a man out of his element, if ever such a man existed yet. As for the friends who had been asked at Allan's request, the widow lady, otherwise Mrs. Pentecost, and her son, the Reverend Samuel, in delicate health, two people less capable apparently of adding to the hilarity of the day could hardly have been discovered in the length and breadth of all England. A young man who plays his part in society by looking on in green spectacles, and listening with a sickly smile, may be a prodigy of intellect and a mine of virtue, but he is hardly, perhaps, the right sort of man to have at a picnic. An old lady afflicted with deafness, whose one inexhaustible subject of interest is the subject of her son, and who, on the happily rare occasions when that son opens his lips, asks everybody eagerly, "What does my boy say?" is a person to be pitied in respect of her infirmities, and a person to be admired in respect of her maternal devotedness, but not a person, if the thing could possibly be avoided, to take to a picnic. Such a man, nevertheless, was the Reverend Samuel Pentecost, and such a woman was the Reverend Samuel's mother; and in the dearth of any other producible guests, there they were, engaged to eat, drink, and be merry for the day at Mr. Armadale's pleasure party to the Norfolk Broads. The arrival of Allan, with his faithful follower Pedgift Junior at his heels, roused the flagging spirits of the party at the cottage. The plan for enabling the governess to join the picnic, if she arrived that day, satisfied even Major Milroy's anxiety to show all proper attention to the lady who was coming into his house. After writing the necessary note of apology and invitation, and addressing it in her very best handwriting to the new governess, Miss Milroy ran upstairs to say good by to her mother, and returned with a smiling face and a side look of relief directed at her father, to announce that there was nothing now to keep any of them a moment longer indoors. The company at once directed their steps to the garden gate, and were there met face to face by the second great difficulty of the day. How were the 6 persons of the picnic to be divided between the 2 open carriages that were in waiting for them? Here again Pedgift Junior exhibited his invaluable faculty of contrivance. This highly cultivated young man possessed in an eminent degree an accomplishment more or less peculiar to all the young men of the age we live in. He was perfectly capable of taking his pleasure without forgetting his business. Such a client as the master of Thorpe Ambrose fell but seldom in his father's way, and to pay special but unobtrusive attention to Allan all through the day was the business of which young Pedgift, while proving himself to be the life and soul of the picnic, never once lost sight from the beginning of the merrymaking to the end. He had detected the state of affairs between Miss Milroy and Allan at a glance, and he at once provided for his client's inclinations in that quarter, by offering, in virtue of his local knowledge, to lead the way in the first carriage, and by asking Major Milroy and the curate if they would do him the honor of accompanying him. "We shall pass a very interesting place to a military man, sir," said young Pedgift, addressing the major with his happy and unblushing confidence. "The remains of a Roman encampment. And my father, sir, who is a subscriber," proceeded this rising lawyer, turning to the curate, "wished me to ask your opinion of the new infant school buildings at Little Gilbeck. Would you kindly give it me as we go along?" He opened the carriage door, and helped in the major and the curate before they could either of them start any difficulties. The necessary result followed. Allan and Miss Milroy rode together in the same carriage, with the extra convenience of a deaf old lady in attendance to keep the squire's compliments within the necessary limits. Never yet had Allan enjoyed such an interview with Miss Milroy as the interview he now obtained on the road to the Broads. The dear old lady, after a little anecdote or two on the subject of her son, did the one thing wanting to secure the perfect felicity of her 2 youthful companions. She became considerately blind for the occasion as well as deaf. A quarter of an hour after the carriage left the major's cottage, the poor old soul, reposing on snug cushions and fanned by a fine summer air, fell peaceably asleep. Allan made love, and Miss Milroy sanctioned the manufacture of that occasionally precious article of human commerce, sublimely indifferent on both sides to a solemn bass accompaniment on 2 notes, played by the curate's mother's unsuspecting nose. The only interruption to the love-making, the snoring being a thing more grave and permanent in its nature, was not interrupted at all, came at intervals from the carriage ahead. Not satisfied with having the major's Roman encampment and the curate's infant schools on his mind, Pedgift Junior rose erect from time to time in his place, and, respectfully hailing the hindmost vehicle, directed Allan's attention, in a shrill tenor voice, and with an excellent choice of language, to objects of interest on the road. The only way to quiet him was to answer, which Allan invariably did by shouting back, "Yes, beautiful!" upon which young Pedgift disappeared again in the recesses of the leading carriage, and took up the Romans and the infants where he had left them last. The scene through which the picnic party was now passing merited far more attention than it received, either from Allan or Allan's friends. An hour's steady driving from the Major's cottage had taken young Armadale and his guests beyond the limits of Midwinter's solitary walk, and was now bringing them nearer and nearer to one of the strangest and loveliest aspects of nature which the inland landscape, not of Norfolk only, but of all England, can show. Little by little the face of the country began to change as the carriages approached the remote and lonely district of the Broads. The wheat fields and turnip fields became perceptibly fewer, and the fat green grazing grounds on either side grew wider and wider in their smooth and sweeping range. Heaps of dry rushes and reeds, laid up for the basket maker and the thatcher, began to appear at the roadside. The old gabled cottages of the early part of the drive dwindled and disappeared, and huts with mud walls rose in their place. With the ancient church towers and the wind and water mills, which had hitherto been the only lofty objects seen over the low marshy flat, there now rose all around the horizon, gliding slow and distant behind fringes of pollard willows, the sails of invisible boats moving on invisible waters. All the strange and startling anomalies presented by an inland agricultural district, isolated from other districts by its intricate surrounding network of pools and streams, holding its communications and carrying its produce by water instead of by land, began to present themselves in closer and closer succession. Nets appeared on cottage palings. Little flat-bottomed boats lay strangely at rest among the flowers in cottage gardens. Farmers' men passed to and fro clad in composite costume of the coast and the field, in sailors' hats and fishermen's boots, and ploughmen's smocks; and even yet the low-lying labyrinth of waters, embosomed in its mystery of solitude, was a hidden labyrinth still. A minute more, and the carriages took a sudden turn from the hard highroad into a little weedy lane. The wheels ran noiseless on the damp and spongy ground. A lonely outlying cottage appeared with its litter of nets and boats. A few yards further on, and the last morsel of firm earth suddenly ended in a tiny creek and quay. One turn more to the end of the quay, and there, spreading its great sheet of water, far and bright and smooth, on the right hand and the left, there, as pure in its spotless blue, as still in its heavenly peacefulness as the summer sky above it, was the first of the Norfolk Broads. The carriages stopped, the love-making broke off, and the venerable Mrs. Pentecost, recovering the use of her senses at a moment's notice, fixed her eyes sternly on Allan the instant she woke. "I see in your face, Mr. Armadale," said the old lady sharply, "that you think I have been asleep." The consciousness of guilt acts differently on the two sexes. In 9 cases out of 10, it is a much more manageable consciousness with a woman than with a man. All the confusion on this occasion was on the man's side. While Allan reddened and looked embarrassed, the quick-witted Miss Milroy instantly embraced the old lady with a burst of innocent laughter. "He is quite incapable, dear Mrs. Pentecost," said the little hypocrite, "of anything so ridiculous as thinking you have been asleep." "All I wish Mr. Armadale to know," pursued the old lady, still suspicious of Allan, "is, that my head being giddy, I am obliged to close my eyes in a carriage. Closing the eyes, Mr. Armadale, is one thing, and going to sleep is another. Where is my son?" The Reverend Samuel appeared silently at the carriage door, and assisted his mother to get out. "Did you enjoy the drive, Sammy?" asked the old lady. "Beautiful scenery, my dear, wasn't it?" Young Pedgift, on whom the arrangements for exploring the Broads devolved, hustled about, giving his orders to the boatman. Major Milroy, placid and patient, sat apart on an overturned punt, and privately looked at his watch. Was it past noon already? More than an hour past. For the first time for many a long year the famous clock at home had struck in an empty workshop. Time had lifted his wonderful scythe, and the corporal and his men had relieved guard, with no master's eye to watch their performances, with no master's hand to encourage them to do their best. The Major sighed as he put his watch back in his pocket. "I'm afraid I'm too old for this sort of thing," thought the good man, looking about him dreamily. "I don't find I enjoy it as much as I thought I should. When are we going on the water, I wonder? Where's Neelie?" Neelie, more properly Miss Milroy, was behind one of the carriages with the promoter of the picnic. They were immersed in the interesting subject of their own Christian names, and Allan was as near a point-blank proposal of marriage as it is well possible for a thoughtless young gentleman of 22 to be. "Tell me the truth," said Miss Milroy, with her eyes modestly riveted on the ground. "When you first knew what my name was, you didn't like it, did you?" "I like everything that belongs to you," rejoined Allan, vigorously. "I think Eleanor is a beautiful name, and yet, I don't know why, I think the Major made an improvement when he changed it to Neelie." "I can tell you why, Mr. Armadale," said the Major's daughter, with great gravity. "There are some unfortunate people in this world whose names are how can I express it? Whose names are misfits. Mine is a misfit. I don't blame my parents, for of course it was impossible to know when I was a baby how I should grow up. But as things are, I and my name don't fit each other. When you hear a young lady called Eleanor, you think of a tall, beautiful, interesting creature directly, the very opposite of me. With my personal appearance, Eleanor sounds ridiculous; and Neelie, as you yourself remarked, is just the thing. No, don't say any more. I'm tired of the subject. I've got another name in my head, if we must speak of names, which is much better worth talking about than mine." She stole a glance at her companion which said plainly enough, "The name is yours." Allan advanced a step nearer to her, and lowered his voice without the slightest necessity to a mysterious whisper. Miss Milroy instantly resumed her investigation of the ground. She looked at it with such extraordinary interest that a geologist might have suspected her of scientific flirtation with the superficial strata. "What name are you thinking of?" asked Allan. Miss Milroy addressed her answer in the form of a remark to the superficial strata, and let them do what they liked with it, in their capacity of conductors of sound. "If I had been a man," she said, "I should so like to have been called Allan." She felt his eyes on her as she spoke, and turning her head aside, became absorbed in the graining of the panel at the back of the carriage. "How beautiful it is!" she exclaimed, with a sudden outburst of interest in the vast subject of varnish. "I wonder how they do it." Man persists and woman yields. Allan declined to shift the ground from love making to coach making. Miss Milroy dropped the subject. "Call me by my name if you really like it," he whispered, persuasively. "Call me Allan for once, just to try." She hesitated, with a heightened color and a charming smile, and shook her head. "I couldn't just yet," she answered softly. "May I call you Neelie? Is it too soon?" She looked at him again, with a sudden disturbance about the bosom of her dress, and a sudden flash of tenderness in her dark gray eyes. "You know best," she said faintly, in a whisper. The inevitable answer was on the tip of Allan's tongue. At the very instant, however, when he opened his lips, the abhorrent high tenor of Pedgift Junior shouting for "Mr. Armadale" rang cheerfully through the quiet air. At the same moment, from the other side of the carriage, the lurid spectacles of the Reverend Samuel showed themselves officiously on the search, and the voice of the Reverend Samuel's mother, who had with great dexterity put the two ideas of the presence of water and a sudden movement among the company together, inquired distractedly if anybody was drowned. Sentiment flies, and love shudders at all demonstrations of the noisy kind. Allan said, "Damn it!" and rejoined young Pedgift. Miss Milroy sighed, and took refuge with her father. "I've done it, Mr. Armadale!" cried young Pedgift, greeting his patron gaily. "We can all go on the water together. I've got the biggest boat on the Broads. The little skiffs," he added, in a lower tone, as he led the way to the quay steps, "besides being ticklish and easily upset, won't hold more than two with the boatman, and the major told me he should feel it his duty to go with his daughter, if we all separated in different boats. I thought that would hardly do, sir," pursued Pedgift Junior, with a respectfully sly emphasis on the words. "And besides, if we had put the old lady into a skiff, with her weight 16 stone if she's a pound we might have had her upside down in the water half her time, which would have occasioned delay, and thrown what you call a damp on the proceedings. Here's the boat, Mr. Armadale. What do you think of it?" The boat added one more to the strangely anomalous objects which appeared at the Broads. It was nothing less than a stout old lifeboat, passing its last declining years on the smooth fresh water, after the stormy days of its youth time on the wild salt sea. A comfortable little cabin for the use of fowlers in the winter season had been built amidships, and a mast and sail adapted for inland navigation had been fitted forward. There was room enough and to spare for the guests, the dinner, and the 3 men in charge. Allan clapped his faithful lieutenant approvingly on the shoulder, and even Mrs. Pentecost, when the whole party were comfortably established on board, took a comparatively cheerful view of the prospects of the picnic. "If anything happens," said the old lady, addressing the company generally, "there's one comfort for all of us. My son can swim." The boat floated out from the creek into the placid waters of the Broad, and the full beauty of the scene opened on the view. On the northward and westward, as the boat reached the middle of the lake, the shore lay clear and low in the sunshine, fringed darkly at certain points by rows of dwarf trees, and dotted here and there in the opener spaces with windmills and reed-thatched cottages of puddled mud. Southward, the great sheet of water narrowed gradually to a little group of close-nestling islands which closed the prospect, while to the east a long gently undulating line of reeds followed the windings of the Broad, and shut out all view of the watery wastes beyond. So clear and so light was the summer air that the one cloud in the eastern quarter of the heaven was the smoke cloud left by a passing steamer, 3 miles distant, and more, on the invisible sea. When the voices of the pleasure party were still, not a sound rose, far or near, but the faint ripple at the bows, as the men, with slow deliberate strokes of their long poles, pressed the boat forward softly over the shallow water. The world and the world's turmoil seemed left behind forever on the land. The silence was the silence of enchantment, the delicious interflow of the soft purity of the sky and the bright tranquillity of the lake. Established in perfect comfort in the boat, the major and his daughter on one side, the curate and his mother on the other, and Allan and young Pedgift between the two, the water party floated smoothly towards the little nest of islands at the end of the Broad. Miss Milroy was in raptures, Allan was delighted, and the major for once forgot his clock. Every one felt pleasurably, in their different ways, the quiet and beauty of the scene. Mrs. Pentecost, in her way, felt it like a clairvoyant, with closed eyes. "Look behind you, Mr. Armadale," whispered young Pedgift. "I think the parson's beginning to enjoy himself." An unwonted briskness, portentous apparently of coming speech, did certainly at that moment enliven the curate's manner. He jerked his head from side to side like a bird, he cleared his throat and clasped his hands, and looked with a gentle interest at the company. Getting into spirits seemed, in the case of this excellent person, to be alarmingly like getting into the pulpit. "Even in this scene of tranquillity," said the Reverend Samuel, coming out softly with his first contribution to the society in the shape of a remark, "the Christian mind, led, so to speak, from one extreme to another, is forcibly recalled to the unstable nature of all earthly enjoyments. How if this calm should not last? How if the winds rose, and the waters became agitated?" "You needn't alarm yourself about that, sir," said young Pedgift. "June's the fine season here, and you can swim." Mrs. Pentecost, mesmerically affected in all probability by the near neighbourhood of her son, opened her eyes suddenly, and asked, with her customary eagerness, "What does my boy say?" The Reverend Samuel repeated his words in the key that suited his mother's infirmity. The old lady nodded in high approval, and pursued her son's train of thought through the medium of a quotation. "Ah!" sighed Mrs. Pentecost, with infinite relish, "he rides the whirlwind, Sammy, and directs the storm." "Noble words," said the Reverend Samuel. "Noble and consoling words." "I say," whispered Allan, "if he goes on much longer in that way, what's to be done?" "I told you, papa, it was a risk to ask them," added Miss Milroy, in another whisper. "My dear," remonstrated the major, "we knew nobody else in the neighborhood; and as Mr. Armadale kindly suggested our bringing our friends, what could we do?" "We can't upset the boat," remarked young Pedgift, with sardonic gravity. "It's a lifeboat, unfortunately. May I venture to suggest putting something into the reverend gentleman's mouth, Mr. Armadale? It's close on 3 o'clock. What do you say to ringing the dinner bell, sir?" Never was the right man more entirely in the right place than Pedgift Junior at the picnic. In 10 minutes more the boat was brought to a standstill among the reeds, the Thorpe Ambrose hampers were unpacked on the roof of the cabin, and the current of the curate's eloquence was checked for the day. How inestimably important in its moral results, and therefore how praiseworthy in itself, is the act of eating and drinking! The social virtues centre in the stomach. A man who is not a better husband, father, and brother after dinner than before, is, digestively speaking, an incurably vicious man. What hidden charms of character disclose themselves, what dormant amiabilities awaken, when our common humanity gathers together to pour out the gastric juice! At the opening of the hampers from Thorpe Ambrose, sweet sociability, offspring of the happy union of civilization and Mrs. Gripper, exhaled among the boating party, and melted in one friendly fusion the discordant elements of which that party had hitherto been composed. Now did the Reverend Samuel Pentecost, whose light had hitherto been hidden under a bushel, prove at last that he could do something by proving that he could eat. Now did Pedgift Junior shine brighter than ever he had shone yet in gems of caustic humour and exquisite fertilities of resource. Now did the squire and the squire's charming guest prove the triple connection between champagne that sparkles, love that grows bolder, and eyes whose vocabulary is without the word No. Now did cheerful old times come back to the major's memory, and cheerful old stories not told for years find their way to the major's lips. And now did Mrs. Pentecost, coming out wakefully in the whole force of her estimable maternal character, seize on a supplementary fork, and ply that useful instrument incessantly between the choicest morsels in the whole round of dishes and the few vacant places left available on the Reverend Samuel's plate. "Don't laugh at my son," cried the old lady, observing the merriment which her proceedings produced among the company. "It's my fault, poor dear. I make him eat." And there are men in this world who, seeing virtues such as these developed at the table, as they are developed nowhere else, can nevertheless rank the glorious privilege of dining with the smallest of the diurnal personal worries which necessity imposes on mankind, with buttoning your waistcoat, for example, or lacing your stays. Trust no such monster as this with your tender secrets, your loves and hatreds, your hopes and fears. His heart is uncorrected by his stomach, and the social virtues are not in him. The last mellow hours of the day and the first cool breezes of the long summer evening had met before the dishes were all laid waste, and the bottles as empty as bottles should be. This point in the proceedings attained, the picnic party looked lazily at Pedgift Junior to know what was to be done next. That inexhaustible functionary was equal as ever to all the calls on him. He had a new amusement ready before the quickest of the company could do so much as ask him what that amusement was to be. "Fond of music on the water, Miss Milroy?" he asked, in his airiest and pleasantest manner. Miss Milroy adored music, both on the water and the land, always excepting the one case where she was practicing the art herself on the piano at home. "We'll get out of the reeds first," said young Pedgift. He gave his orders to the boatman, dived briskly into the little cabin, and reappeared with a concertina in his hand. "Neat, Miss Milroy, isn't it?" he observed, pointing to his initials, inlaid on the instrument in mother of pearl. "My name's Augustus, like my father's. Some of my friends knock off the A, and call me Gustus Junior. A small joke goes a long way among friends, doesn't it, Mr. Armadale? I sing a little to my own accompaniment, ladies and gentlemen, and if quite agreeable, I shall be proud and happy to do my best." "Stop!" cried Mrs. Pentecost. "I dote on music." With this formidable announcement, the old lady opened a prodigious leather bag, from which she never parted night or day, and took out an ear trumpet of the old-fashioned kind, something between a key bugle and a French horn. "I don't care to use the thing generally," explained Mrs. Pentecost, "because I'm afraid of its making me deafer than ever. But I can't and won't miss the music. I dote on music. If you'll hold the other end, Sammy, I'll stick it in my ear. Neelie, my dear, tell him to begin." Young Pedgift was troubled with no nervous hesitation. He began at once, not with songs of the light and modern kind, such as might have been expected from an amateur of his age and character, but with declamatory and patriotic bursts of poetry, set to the bold and blatant music which the people of England loved dearly at the earlier part of the present century, and which, whenever they can get it, they love dearly still. The Death of Marmion, the Battle of the Baltic, the Bay of Biscay, Nelson, under various vocal aspects, as exhibited by the late Braham. These were the songs in which the roaring concertina and strident tenor of Gustus Junior exulted together. "Tell me when you're tired, ladies and gentlemen," said the minstrel solicitor. "There's no conceit about me. Will you have a little sentiment by way of variety? Shall I wind up with the Mistletoe Bough and Poor Marianne?" Having favoured his audience with those two cheerful melodies, young Pedgift respectfully requested the rest of the company to follow his vocal example in turn, offering, in every case, to play a running accompaniment impromptu, if the singer would only be so obliging as to favour him with the key note. "Go on, somebody!" cried Mrs. Pentecost eagerly. "I tell you again, I dote on music. We haven't had half enough yet, have we, Sammy?" The Reverend Samuel made no reply. The unhappy man had reasons of his own, not exactly in his bosom, but a little lower, for remaining silent in the midst of the general hilarity and the general applause. Alas for humanity! Even maternal love is alloyed with mortal fallibility. Owing much already to his excellent mother, the Reverend Samuel was now additionally indebted to her for a smart indigestion. Nobody, however, noticed as yet the signs and tokens of internal revolution in the curate's face. Everybody was occupied in entreating everybody else to sing. Miss Milroy appealed to the founder of the feast. "Do sing something, Mr. Armadale," she said. "I should so like to hear you." "If you once begin, sir," added the cheerful Pedgift, "you'll find it get uncommonly easy as you go on. Music is a science which requires to be taken by the throat at starting." "With all my heart," said Allan, in his good-humoured way. "I know lots of tunes, but the worst of it is, the words escape me. I wonder if I can remember one of Moore's melodies. My poor mother used to be fond of teaching me Moore's melodies when I was a boy." "Whose melodies?" asked Mrs. Pentecost. "Moore's? Aha! I know Tom Moore by heart." "Perhaps in that case you will be good enough to help me, ma'am, if my memory breaks down," rejoined Allan. "I'll take the easiest melody in the whole collection, if you'll allow me. Everybody knows it. Eveleen's Bower. I'm familiar, in a general sort of way, with the national melodies of England, Scotland, and Ireland," said Pedgift Junior. "I'll accompany you, sir, with the greatest pleasure. This is the sort of thing, I think." He seated himself cross-legged on the roof of the cabin, and burst into a complicated musical improvisation wonderful to hear, a mixture of instrumental flourishes and groans, a jig corrected by a dirge, and a dirge enlivened by a jig. "That's the sort of thing," said young Pedgift, with his smile of supreme confidence. "Fire away, sir." Mrs. Pentecost elevated her trumpet, and Allan elevated his voice. "Oh, weep for the hour when to Evelyn's bower..." He stopped. The accompaniment stopped. The audience waited. "It's a most extraordinary thing," said Allan. "I thought I had the next line on the tip of my tongue, and it seems to have escaped me. I'll begin again, if you have no objection. Oh, weep for the hour when to Evelyn's bower..." "The Lord of the Valley with false vows came," said Mrs. Pentecost. "Thank you, ma'am," said Allan. "Now I shall get on smoothly. Oh, weep for the hour when to Evelyn's bower the Lord of the Valley with false vows came. The moon was shining bright..." "No!" said Mrs. Pentecost. "I beg your pardon, ma'am," remonstrated Allan. "The moon was shining bright..." "The moon wasn't doing anything of the kind," said Mrs. Pentecost. Pedgift Junior, foreseeing a dispute, persevered sotto voce with the accompaniment, in the interests of harmony. "Moore's own words, ma'am," said Allan, "in my mother's copy of melodies." "Your mother's copy was wrong," retorted Mrs. Pentecost. "Didn't I tell you just now that I knew Tom Moore by heart?" Pedgift Junior's peacemaking concertina still flourished and groaned in the minor key. "Well, what did the moon do?" asked Allan, in despair. "What the moon ought to have done, sir, or Tom Moore wouldn't have written it so," rejoined Mrs. Pentecost. "The moon hid her light from the heaven that night, and wept behind her clouds o'er the maiden's shame. I wish that young man would leave off playing," added Mrs. Pentecost, venting her rising irritation on Gustus Junior. "I've had enough of him. He tickles my ears." "Proud, I'm sure, ma'am," said the unblushing Pedgift. "The whole science of music consists in tickling the ears." "We seem to be drifting into a sort of argument," remarked Major Milroy, placidly. "Wouldn't it be better if Mr. Armadale went on with his song?" "Do go on, Mr. Armadale," added the major's daughter. "Do go on, Mr. Pedgift." "One of them doesn't know the words, and the other doesn't know the music," said Mrs. Pentecost. "Let them go on if they can." "Sorry to disappoint you, ma'am," said Pedgift Junior. "I'm ready to go on myself to any extent. Now, Mr. Armadale." Allan opened his lips to take up the unfinished melody where he had last left it. Before he could utter a note, the curate suddenly rose with a ghastly face, and a hand pressed convulsively over the middle region of his waistcoat. "What's the matter?" cried the whole boating party in chorus. "I am exceedingly unwell," said the Reverend Samuel Pentecost. The boat was instantly in a state of confusion. Eveleen's Bower expired on Allan's lips, and even the irrepressible concertina of Pedgift was silenced at last. The alarm proved to be quite needless. Mrs. Pentecost's son possessed a mother, and that mother had a bag. In 2 seconds the art of medicine occupied the place left vacant in the attention of the company by the art of music. "Rub it gently, Sammy," said Mrs. Pentecost. "I'll get out the bottles and give you a dose. It's his poor stomach, Major. Hold my trumpet, somebody, and stop the boat. You take that bottle, Neelie, my dear, and you take this one, Mr. Armadale, and give them to me as I want them. Ah, poor dear, I know what's the matter with him. Want of power here, Major, cold, acid, and flabby. ginger to warm him, soda to correct him, sal volatile to hold him up. There, Sammy, drink it before it settles, and then go and lie down, my dear, in that dog kennel of a place they call the cabin. No more music," added Mrs. Pentecost, shaking her forefinger at the proprietor of the concertina, "unless it's a hymn, and that I don't object to." Nobody appearing to be in a fit frame of mind for singing a hymn, the all accomplished Pedgift drew up on his store of local knowledge, and produced a new idea. The course of the boat was immediately changed under his direction. In a few minutes more the company found themselves in a little island creek, with a lonely cottage at the far end of it, and a perfect forest of reeds closing the view all round them. "What do you say, ladies and gentlemen, to stepping on shore and seeing what a reed cutter's cottage looks like?" suggested young Pedgift. "We say yes, to be sure," answered Allan. "I think our spirits have been a little dashed by Mr. Pentecost's illness and Mrs. Pentecost's bag," he added, in a whisper to Miss Milroy. "A change of this sort is the very thing we want to set us all going again." He and young Pedgift handed Miss Milroy out of the boat. The major followed. Mrs. Pentecost sat immovable as the Egyptian Sphinx, with her bag on her knees, mounting guard over Sammy in the cabin. "We must keep the fun going, sir," said Allan, as he helped the major over the side of the boat. "We haven't half done yet with the enjoyment of the day." His voice seconded his hearty belief in his own prediction to such good purpose that even Mrs. Pentecost heard him, and ominously shook her head. "Ah," sighed the curate's mother, "if you were as old as I am, young gentleman, you wouldn't feel quite so sure of the enjoyment of the day." So, in rebuke of the rashness of youth, spoke the caution of age. The negative view is notoriously the safe view, all the world over, and the Pentecost philosophy is, as a necessary consequence, generally in the right. End of chapter 8.
Book the Second, Chapter 9 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 9. Fate or Chance? It was close on 6 o'clock when Allan and his friends left the boat, and the evening influence was creeping already, in its mystery and its stillness, over the watery solitude of the Broads. The shore in these wild regions was not like the shore elsewhere. Firm as it looked, the garden ground in front of the reed cutter's cottage was floating ground that rose and fell and oozed into puddles under the pressure of the foot. The boatman who guided the visitors warned them to keep to the path, and pointed through gaps in the reeds and pollards to grassy places, on which strangers would have walked confidently, where the crust of earth was not strong enough to bear the weight of a child over the unfathomed depth of slime and water beneath. The solitary cottage, built of planks pitched black, stood on ground that had been steadied and strengthened by resting it on piles. A little wooden tower rose at one end of the roof, and served as a lookout post in the fowling season. From this elevation the eye ranged far and wide over a wilderness of winding water and lonesome marsh. If the reed cutter had lost his boat, he would have been as completely isolated from all communication with town or village as if his place of abode had been a light vessel instead of a cottage. Neither he nor his family complained of their solitude, or looked in any way the rougher or the worse for it. His wife received the visitors hospitably, in a snug little room, with a raftered ceiling, and windows which looked like windows in a cabin on board ship. His wife's father told stories of the famous days when the smugglers came up from the sea at night, rowing through the network of rivers with muffled oars till they gained the lonely Broads, and sank their spirit casks in the water, far from the coast guard's reach. His wild little children played at hide and seek with the visitors, and the visitors ranged in and out of the cottage, and round the morsel of firm earth on which it stood, surprised and delighted by the novelty of all they saw. The one person who noticed the advance of the evening, the one person who thought of the flying time and the stationary Pentecosts in the boat, was young Pedgift. That experienced pilot of the Broads looked askance at his watch, and drew Allan aside at the first opportunity. "I don't wish to hurry you, Mr. Armadale," said Pedgift Junior, "but the time is getting on, and there's a lady in the case." "A lady?" repeated Allan. "Yes, sir," rejoined young Pedgift. "A lady from London, connected, if you'll allow me to jog your memory, with a bonny chaise and white harness." "Good heavens! The governess!" cried Allan. "Why, we have forgotten all about her." "Don't be alarmed, sir. There's plenty of time, if we only get into the boat again. This is how it stands, Mr. Armadale. We settled, if you remember, to have the gypsy tea making at the next broad to this, Hurlemere?" "Certainly," said Allan. "Hurlemere is the place where my friend Midwinter has promised to come and meet us." "Hurlemere is where the governess will be, sir, if your coachman follows my directions," pursued young Pedgift. "We have got nearly an hour's punting to do, along the twists and turns of the narrow waters, which they call the Sounds here, between this and Hurlemere; and according to my calculations we must get on board again in 5 minutes, if we are to be in time to meet the governess and to meet your friend." "We mustn't miss my friend on any account," said Allan, "or the governess either, of course. I'll tell the major." Major Milroy was at that moment preparing to mount the wooden watch tower of the cottage to see the view. The ever useful Pedgift volunteered to go up with him, and rattle off all the necessary local explanations in half the time which the reed cutter would occupy in describing his own neighborhood to a stranger. Allan remained standing in front of the cottage, more quiet and more thoughtful than usual. His interview with young Pedgift had brought his absent friend to his memory for the first time since the picnic party had started. He was surprised that Midwinter, so much in his thoughts on all other occasions, should have been so long out of his thoughts now. Something troubled him, like a sense of self reproach, as his mind reverted to the faithful friend at home, toiling hard over the steward's books, in his interest and for his sake. "Dear old fellow," thought Allan, "I shall be so glad to see him at the Mere. The day's pleasure won't be complete till he joins us." "Should I be right or wrong, Mr. Armadale, if I guessed that you were thinking of somebody?" asked a voice softly behind him. Allan turned, and found the major's daughter at his side. Miss Milroy, not unmindful of a certain tender interview which had taken place behind the carriage, had noticed her admirer standing thoughtfully by himself, and had determined on giving him another opportunity while her father and young Pedgift were at the top of the watch-tower. "You know everything," said Allan, smiling. "I was thinking of somebody." Miss Milroy stole a glance at him, a glance of gentle encouragement. There could be but one human creature in Mr. Armadale's mind after what had passed between them that morning. It would be only an act of mercy to take him back again at once to the interrupted conversation of a few hours since on the subject of names. "I have been thinking of somebody, too," she said, half inviting, half repelling the coming avowal. "If I tell you the first letter of my somebody's name, will you tell me the first letter of yours?" "I will tell you anything you like," rejoined Allan, with the utmost enthusiasm. She still shrank coquettishly from the very subject that she wanted to approach. "Tell me your letter first," she said, in low tones, looking away from him. Allan laughed. "M," he said, "is my first letter." She started a little. Strange that he should be thinking of her by her surname instead of her Christian name, but it mattered little as long as he was thinking of her. "What is your letter?" asked Allan. She blushed and smiled. "A, if you will have it," she answered, in a reluctant little whisper. She stole another look at him, and luxuriously protracted her enjoyment of the coming avowal once more. "How many syllables is the name in?" she asked, drawing patterns shyly on the ground with the end of the parasol. No man with the slightest knowledge of the sex would have been rash enough, in Allan's position, to tell her the truth. Allan, who knew nothing whatever of women's natures, and who told the truth right and left in all mortal emergencies, answered as if he had been under examination in a court of justice. "It's a name in 3 syllables," he said. Miss Milroy's downcast eyes flashed up at him like lightning. "3?" she repeated in the blankest astonishment. Allan was too inveterately straightforward to take the warning even now. "I'm not strong at my spelling, I know," he said, with his light-hearted laugh, "but I don't think I'm wrong in calling Midwinter a name in 3 syllables. I was thinking of my friend. But never mind my thoughts. Tell me who A is. Tell me whom you were thinking of." "Of the first letter of the alphabet, Mr. Armadale, and I beg positively to inform you of nothing more." With that annihilating answer, the major's daughter put up a parasol, and walked back by herself to the boat. Allan stood petrified with amazement. If Miss Milroy had actually boxed his ears, and there is no denying that she had privately longed to devote her hand to that purpose, he could hardly have felt more bewildered than he felt now. "What on earth have I done?" he asked himself, helplessly, as the major and young Pedgift joined him, and the three walked down together to the water side. "I wonder what she'll say to me next." She said absolutely nothing. She never so much as looked at Allan when he took his place in the boat. There she sat, with her eyes and her complexion both much brighter than usual, taking the deepest interest in the curate's progress toward recovery, in the state of Mrs. Pentecost's spirits, in Pedgift Junior, for whom she ostentatiously made room enough to let him sit beside her, in the scenery and the reed cutter's cottage, in everybody and everything but Allan, whom she would have married with the greatest pleasure 5 minutes since. "I'll never forgive him," thought the major's daughter. "To be thinking of that ill-bred wretch when I was thinking of him, and to make me all but confess it before I found him out! Thank Heaven Mr. Pedgift is in the boat." In this frame of mind Miss Neelie applied herself forthwith to the fascination of Pedgift and the discomfiture of Allan. "Oh, Mr. Pedgift, how extremely clever and kind of you to think of showing us that sweet cottage! Lonely, Mr. Armadale? I don't think it's lonely at all. I should like of all things to live there. What would this picnic have been without you, Mr. Pedgift? You can't think how I have enjoyed it since we got into the boat." "Cool, Mr. Armadale? What can you possibly mean by saying it's cool? It's the warmest evening we've had this summer. And the music, Mr. Pedgift! How nice it was of you to bring your concertina! I wonder if I could accompany you on the piano? I would so like to try. Oh yes, Mr. Armadale, no doubt you meant to do something musical, too, and I dare say you sing very well when you know the words; but to tell you the truth, I always did, and always shall, hate Moore's melodies." Thus, with merciless dexterity of manipulation, did Miss Milroy work that sharpest female weapon of offense, the tongue. And thus she would have used it for some time longer, if Allan had only shown the necessary jealousy, or if Pedgift had only afforded the necessary encouragement. But adverse fortune had decreed that she should select for her victims 2 men essentially unassailable under existing circumstances. Allan was too innocent of all knowledge of female subtleties and susceptibilities to understand anything, except that the charming Neelie was unreasonably out of temper with him without the slightest cause. The wary Pedgift, as became one of the quick-witted youth of the present generation, submitted to female influence, with his eye fixed immovably all the time on his own interests. Many a young man of the past generation, who was no fool, has sacrificed everything for love. Not one young man in 10,000 of the present generation, except the fools, has sacrificed a halfpenny. The daughters of Eve still inherit their mother's merits, and commit their mother's faults. But the sons of Adam in these latter days are men who would have handed the famous apple back with a bow, and a "Thanks, no, it might get me into a scrape." When Allan, surprised and disappointed, moved away out of Miss Milroy's reach to the forward part of the boat, Pedgift Junior rose and followed him. "You're a very nice girl," thought this shrewdly sensible young man, "but a client's a client, and I'm sorry to inform you, miss, it won't do." He set himself at once to rouse Allan's spirits by diverting his attention to a new subject. There was to be a regatta that autumn on one of the boats, and his client's opinion as a yachtsman might be valuable to the committee. "Something new, I should think, to you, sir, in a sailing match on fresh water?" he said, in his most ingratiatory manner. And Allan, instantly interested, answered, "Quite new. Do tell me about it." As for the rest of the party, at the other end of the boat, they were in a fair way to confirm Mrs. Pentcoast's doubt whether the hilarity of the picnic would last the day out. Poor Neelie's natural feeling of irritation under the disappointment which Allan's awkwardness had inflicted on her was now exasperated into silent and settled resentment by her own keen sense of humiliation and defeat. The major had relapsed into his habitually dreamy, absent manner. His mind was turning monotonously with the wheels of his clock. The curate still secluded his indigestion from public view in the innermost recesses of the cabin; and the curate's mother, with a second dose ready at a moment's notice, sat on guard at the door. Women of Mrs. Pentecost's age and character generally enjoy their own bad spirits. "This," sighed the old lady, wagging her head with a smile of sour satisfaction, "is what you call the day's pleasure, is it? Ah, what fools we all were to leave our comfortable homes!" Meanwhile the boat floated smoothly along the windings of the watery labyrinth which lay between the two Broads. The view on either side was now limited to nothing but interminable rows of reeds. Not a sound was heard far or near, not so much as a glimpse of cultivated or inhabited land appeared anywhere. "A trifle dreary hereabouts, Mr. Armadale," said the ever cheerful Pedgift; "but we are just out of it now. Look ahead, sir! Here we are at Hurle Mere." The reeds opened back on the right hand and the left, and the boat glided suddenly into the wide circle of the pool. Round the nearer half of the circle the eternal reeds still fringed the margin of the water. Round the further half the land appeared again, here rolling back from the pool in desolated sandhills, there rising above it in a sweep of grassy shore. At one point the ground was occupied by a plantation, and at another by the outbuildings of a lonely old red brick house, with a strip of by road near, that skirted the garden wall and ended at the pool. The sun was sinking in the clear heaven, and the water, where the sun's reflection failed to tinge it, was beginning to look black and cold. The solitude that had been soothing, the silence that had felt like an enchantment on the other Broad, in the day's vigorous prime, was a solitude that saddened here, a silence that struck cold in the stillness and melancholy of the day's decline. The course of the boat was directed across the mere to a creek in the grassy shore. One or two of the little flat-bottomed ponds peculiar to the Broads lay in the creek, and the reed cutters to whom the ponds belonged, surprised at the appearance of strangers, came out, staring silently, from behind an angle of the old garden wall. Not another sign of life was visible anywhere. No pony chaise had been seen by the reed cutters; no stranger, either man or woman, had approached the shores of Hurle Mere that day. Young Pedgift took another look at his watch, and addressed himself to Miss Milroy. "You may or may not see the governess when you get back to Thorpe Ambrose," he said; "but, as the time stands now, you won't see her here. You know best, Mr. Armadale," he added, turning to Allan, "whether your friend is to be depended on to keep his appointment?" "I am certain he is to be depended on," replied Allan, looking about him, in unconcealed disappointment at Midwinter's absence. "Very good," pursued Pedgift Junior. "If we light the fire for our gypsy tea making on the open ground there, your friend may find us out, sir, by the smoke. That's the Indian dodge for picking up a lost man on the prairie, Miss Milroy, and it's pretty nearly wild enough, isn't it, to be a prairie here?" "There are some temptations, principally those of the smaller kind, which it is not in the defensive capacity of female human nature to resist. The temptation to direct the whole force of her influence, as the one young lady of the party, toward the instant overthrow of Allan's arrangement for meeting his friend, was too much for the major's daughter. She turned on the smiling Pedgift with a look which ought to have overwhelmed him. But who ever overwhelmed a solicitor? "I think it's the most lonely, dreary, hideous place I ever saw in my life," said Miss Neelie. "If you insist on making tea here, Mr. Pedgift, don't make any for me. No, I shall stop in the boat; and, though I am absolutely dying with thirst, I shall touch nothing till we get back again to the other Broad." The major opened his lips to remonstrate. To his daughter's infinite delight, Mrs. Pentecost rose from her seat before he could say a word, and, after surveying the whole landward prospect, and seeing nothing in the shape of a vehicle anywhere, asked indignantly whether they were going all the way back again to the place where they had left the carriages in the middle of the day. On ascertaining that this was, in fact, the arrangement proposed, and that, from the nature of the country, the carriages could not have been ordered round to Hurle Mere without, in the first instance, sending them the whole of the way back to Thorpe Ambrose, Mrs. Pentecost, speaking in her son's interests, instantly declared that no earthly power should induce her to be out on the water after dark. "Call me a boat!" cried the old lady in great agitation. "Wherever there's water, there's a night mist, and wherever there's a night mist, my son Samuel catches cold. Don't talk to me about your moonlight and your tea making. You're all mad! Hi, you two men there!" cried Mrs. Pentecost, hailing the silent reed cutters on shore. "Sixpence apiece for you, if you'll take me and my son back in your boat." Before young Pedgift could interfere, Allan himself settled the difficulty this time, with perfect patience and good temper. "I can't think, Mrs. Pentecost, of your going back in any boat but the boat you have come out in," he said. "There is not the least need, as you and Miss Milroy don't like the place, for anybody to go on shore here but me. I must go on shore. My friend Midwinter never broke his promise to me yet, and I can't consent to leave Hurle Mere as long as there is a chance of his keeping his appointment. But there's not the least reason in the world why I should stand in the way on that account. You have the major and Mr. Pedgift to take care of you, and you can get back to the carriages before dark if you go at once. I will wait here, and give my friend half an hour more, and then I can follow you in one of the reed cutters' boats." "That's the most sensible thing, Mr. Armadale, you've said to day," remarked Mrs. Pentecost, seating herself again in a violent hurry. "Tell them to be quick!" cried the old lady, shaking her fist at the boatmen. "Tell them to be quick!" Allan gave the necessary directions, and stepped on shore. The wary Pedgift, sticking fast to his client, tried to follow. "We can't leave you here alone, sir," he said, protesting eagerly in a whisper. "Let the major take care of the ladies, and let me keep you company at the Mere." "No, no," said Allan, pressing him back. "They're all in low spirits on board. If you want to be of service to me, stop like a good fellow where you are, and do your best to keep the thing going." He waved his hand, and the men pushed the boat off from the shore. The others all waved their hands in return, except the major's daughter, who sat apart from the rest, with her face hidden under her parasol. The tears stood thick in Neelie's eyes. Her last angry feeling against Allan died out, and her heart went back to him penitently the moment he left the boat. "How good he is to us all," she thought, "and what a wretch I am!" She got up, with every generous impulse in her nature urging her to make atonement to him. She got up, reckless of appearances, and looked after him with eager eyes and flushed cheeks, as he stood alone on the shore. "Don't be long, Mr. Armadale," she said, with a desperate disregard of what the rest of the company thought of her. The boat was already far out in the water, and with all Neelie's resolution the words were spoken in a faint little voice, which failed to reach Allan's ears. The one sound he heard, as the boat gained the opposite extremity of the Mere, and disappeared slowly among the reeds, was the sound of the concertina. The indefatigable Pedgift was keeping things going, evidently under the auspices of Mrs. Pentecost, by performing a sacred melody. Left by himself, Allan lit a cigar, and took a turn backward and forward on the shore. "She might have said a word to me at parting," he thought. "I've done everything for the best. I've as good as told her how fond of her I am, and this is the way she treats me!" He stopped, and stood looking absently at the sinking sun and the fast darkening waters of the Mere. Some inscrutable influence in the scene forced its way stealthily into his mind, and diverted his thoughts from Miss Milroy to his absent friend. He started, and looked about him. The reed cutters had gone back to their retreat behind the angle of the wall. Not a living creature was visible, not a sound rose anywhere along the dreary shore. Even Allan's spirits began to get depressed. It was nearly an hour after the time when Midwinter had promised to be at Hurle Mere. He had himself arranged to walk to the pool, with a stable boy from Thorpe Ambrose as his guide, by lanes and footpaths which shortened the distance by the road. The boy knew the country well, and Midwinter was habitually punctual at all his appointments. Had anything gone wrong at Thorpe Ambrose? Had some accident happened on the way? Determined to remain no longer doubting and idling by himself, Allan made up his mind to walk inland from the Mere, on the chance of meeting his friend. He went round at once to the angle in the wall, and asked one of the reed cutters to show him the footpath to Thorpe Ambrose. The man led him away from the road, and pointed to a barely perceptible break in the outer trees of the plantation. After pausing for one more useless look around him, Allan turned his back on the Mere and made for the trees. For a few paces the path ran straight through the plantation. Thence it took a sudden turn, and the water and the open country became both lost to view. Allan steadily followed the grassy track before him, seeing nothing and hearing nothing, until he came to another winding of the path. Turning in the new direction, he saw dimly a human figure sitting alone at the foot of one of the trees. 2 steps nearer were enough to make the figure familiar to him. "Midwinter!" he exclaimed, in astonishment. "This is not the place where I was to meet you. What are you waiting for here?" Midwinter rose without answering. The evening dimness among the trees, which obscured his face, made his silence doubly perplexing. Allan went on eagerly questioning him. "Did you come here by yourself?" he asked. "I thought the boy was to guide you." "This time," Midwinter answered. "When we got as far as these trees," he said, "I sent the boy back. He told me I was close to the place, and couldn't miss it." "What made you stop here when he left you?" reiterated Allan. "Why didn't you walk on?" "Don't despise me," answered the other. "I hadn't the courage." "Not the courage?" repeated Allan. He paused a moment. "Oh, I know," he resumed, putting his hand gayly on Midwinter's shoulder. "You're still shy of the Milroys. What nonsense, when I told you myself that your peace was made at the cottage!" "I wasn't thinking, Allan, of your friends at the cottage. The truth is, I'm hardly myself to day. I am ill and unnerved. Trifles startle me." He stopped, and shrank away under the anxious scrutiny of Allan's eyes. "If you will have it," he burst out, abruptly, "the horror of that night on board the wreck has got me again. There's a dreadful oppression on my head, there's a dreadful sinking at my heart. I am afraid of something happening to us if we don't part before the day is out. I can't break my promise to you. For God's sake, release me from it, and let me go back!" Remonstrance to any one who knew Midwinter was plainly useless at that moment. Allan humored him. "Come out of this dark, airless place," he said, "and we will talk about it. The water and the open sky are within a stone's throw of us. I hate a wood in the evening; it even gives me the horrors. You have been working too hard over the steward's books. Come and breathe freely in the blessed open air." Midwinter stopped, considered for a moment, and suddenly submitted. "You're right," he said, "and I'm wrong, as usual. I'm wasting time and distressing you to no purpose. What folly to ask you to let me go back! Suppose you had said yes?" "Well?" asked Allan. "Well," repeated Midwinter, "something would have happened at the first step to stop me, that's all. Come on." They walked together in silence on the way to the Mere. At the last turn in the path Allan's cigar went out. While he stopped to light it again, Midwinter walked on before him, and was the first to come in sight of the open ground. Allan had just kindled the match, when, to his surprise, his friend came back to him round the turn in the path. There was light enough to show objects more clearly in this part of the plantation. The match, as Midwinter faced him, dropped on the instant from Allan's hand. "Good God!" he cried, starting back. "You look as you looked on board the wreck!" Midwinter held up his hand for silence. He spoke with his wild eyes riveted on Allan's face, with his white lips close at Allan's ear. "You remember how I looked?" he answered in a whisper. "Do you remember what I said when you and the doctor were talking of the dream?" "I have forgotten the dream," said Allan. As he made that answer, Midwinter took his hand and led him round the last turn in the path. "Do you remember it now?" he asked, and pointed to the Mere. The sun was sinking in the cloudless westward heaven. The waters of the Mere lay beneath, tinged red by the dying light. The open country stretched away, darkening drearily already on the right hand and the left. And on the near margin of the pool, where all had been solitude before, there now stood, fronting the sunset, the figure of a woman. The two Armadales stood together in silence, and looked at the lonely figure and the dreary view. Midwinter was the first to speak. "Your own eyes have seen it," he said. "Now look at your own words." He opened the narrative of the dream, and held it under Allan's eyes. His finger pointed to the lines which recorded the first vision. His voice, sinking lower and lower, repeated the words: "The sense came to me of being left alone in the darkness. I waited. The darkness opened, and showed me the vision, as in a picture, of a broad, lonely pool surrounded by open ground. Above the further margin of the pool I saw the cloudless western sky, red with the light of sunset. On the near margin of the pool there stood the shadow of a woman." He ceased, and let the hand which held the manuscript drop to his side. The other hand pointed to the lonely figure, standing with its back turned on them, fronting the setting sun. "There," he said, "stands the living woman, in the shadow's place. There speaks the first of the dream warnings to you and to me. Let the future time find us still together, and the second figure that stands in the shadow's place will be mine." Even Allan was silenced by the terrible certainty of conviction with which he spoke. In the pause that followed, the figure at the pool moved, and walked slowly away round the margin of the shore. Allan stepped out beyond the last of the trees, and gained a wider view of the open ground. The first object that met his eyes was the pony chaise from Thorpe Ambrose. He turned back to Midwinter with a laugh of relief. "What nonsense have you been talking?" he said. "And what nonsense have I been listening to? It's the governess at last." Midwinter made no reply. Allan took him by the arm, and tried to lead him on. He released himself suddenly, and seized Allan with both hands, holding him back from the figure at the pool, as he had held him back from the cabin door on the deck of the timber ship. Once again the effort was in vain. Once again Allan broke away as easily as he had broken away in the past time. "One of us must speak to her," he said, "and if you want, I will." He had only advanced a few steps toward the mere, when he heard, or thought he heard, a voice faintly calling after him, once and once only, the word farewell. He stopped with a feeling of uneasy surprise, and looked round. "Was that you, Midwinter?" he asked. There was no answer. After hesitating a moment more, Allan returned to the plantation. Midwinter was gone. He looked back at the pool, doubtful in the new emergency what to do next. The lonely figure had altered its course in the interval. It had turned, and was advancing toward the trees. Allan had been evidently either heard or seen. It was impossible to leave a woman unbefriended, in that helpless position, and in that solitary place. For the second time, Allan went out from the trees to meet her. As he came within sight of her face, he stopped, in ungovernable astonishment. The sudden revelation of her beauty, as she smiled and looked at him inquiringly, suspended the movement in his limbs and the words on his lips. A vague doubt beset him whether it was the governess, after all. He roused himself, and, advancing a few paces, mentioned his name. "May I ask," he added, "if I have the pleasure?" The lady met him easily and gracefully halfway. "Major Milroy's governess," she said. "Miss Gwilt." End of chapter. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Book the Second, Chapter 10 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. 10. The Housemaid's Face. All was quiet at Thorpe Ambrose. The hall was solitary, the rooms were dark. The servants, waiting for the supper hour in the garden at the back of the house, looked up at the clear heaven and the rising moon, and agreed that there was little prospect of the return of the picnic party until later in the night. The general opinion, led by the high authority of the cook, predicted that they might all sit down to supper without the least fear of being disturbed by the bell. Having arrived at this conclusion, the servants assembled round the table, and exactly at the moment when they sat down, the bell rang. The footman, wondering, went upstairs to open the door, and found to his astonishment Midwinter waiting alone on the threshold, and looking, in the servant's opinion, miserably ill. He asked for a light, and, saying he wanted nothing else, withdrew at once to his room. The footman went back to his fellow servants, and reported that something had certainly happened to his master's friend. On entering his room, Midwinter closed the door, and hurriedly filled a bag with the necessaries for traveling. This done, he took from a locked drawer, and placed in the breast pocket of his coat, some little presents which Allan had given him: a cigar case, a purse, and a set of studs in plain gold. Having possessed himself of these memorials, he snatched up the bag and laid his hand on the door. There, for the first time, he paused. There, the headlong haste of all his actions thus far suddenly ceased, and the hard despair in his face began to soften. He waited, with the door in his hand. Up to that moment he had been conscious of but one motive that animated him, but one purpose that he was resolute to achieve. For Allan's sake, he had said to himself, when he looked back toward the fatal landscape and saw his friend leaving him to meet the woman at the pool. For Allan's sake, he had said again, when he crossed the open country beyond the wood, and saw afar, in the gray twilight, the long line of embankment and the distant glimmer of the railway lamps beckoning him away already to the iron road. It was only when he now paused before he closed the door behind him, it was only when his own impetuous rapidity of action came for the first time to a check, that the nobler nature of the man rose in protest against the superstitious despair which was hurrying him from all that he held dear. His conviction of the terrible necessity of leaving Allan for Allan's good had not been shaken for an instant since he had seen the first vision of the dream realized on the shores of the Mere. But now, for the first time, his own heart rose against him in unanswerable rebuke. Go if you must and will, but remember the time when you were ill and he sat by your bedside, friendless, and he opened his heart to you, and write if you fear to speak, write and ask him to forgive you before you leave him forever. The half-open door closed again softly. Midwinter sat down at the writing-table and took up the pen. He tried again and again, and yet again, to write the farewell words. He tried till the floor all round him was littered with torn sheets of paper. Turn from them which way he would, the old time still came back and faced him reproachfully. The spacious bedchamber in which he sat narrowed, in spite of him, to the sick usher's garret at the West Country Inn. The kind hand that had once patted him on the shoulder touched him again. The kind voice that had cheered him spoke unchangeably in the old friendly tones. He flung his arms on the table, and dropped his head on them in tearless despair. The parting words that his tongue was powerless to utter, his pen was powerless to write. Mercilessly in earnest, his superstition pointed to him to go while the time was his own. Mercilessly in earnest, his love for Allan held him back till the farewell plea for pardon and pity was written. He rose with a sudden resolution, and rang for the servant. "When Mr. Armadale returns," he said, "ask him to excuse my coming downstairs, and say that I am trying to get to sleep." He locked the door and put out the light, and sat down alone in the darkness. "The night will keep us apart," he said, "and time may help me to write. I may go in the early morning. I may go while—" The thought died in him uncompleted, and the sharp agony of the struggle forced to his lips the first cry of suffering that had escaped him yet. He waited in the darkness. As the time stole on, his senses remained mechanically awake, but his mind began to sink slowly under the heavy strain that had now been laid on it for some hours past. A dull vacancy possessed him. He made no attempt to kindle the light and write once more. He never started. He never moved to the open window when the first sound of approaching wheels broke in on the silence of the night.
He heard the carriages draw up at the door. He heard the horses champing their bits. He heard the voices of Allan and young Pedgift on the steps, and still he sat quiet in the darkness, and still no interest was aroused in him by the sounds that reached his ear from outside. The voices remained audible after the carriages had been driven away. The two young men were evidently lingering on the steps before they took leave of each other. Every word they said reached Midwinter through the open window. Their one subject of conversation was the new governess. Allan's voice was loud in her praise. He had never passed such an hour of delight in his life as the hour he had spent with Miss Gwilt in the boat on the way from Hurle to the picnic party waiting at the other Broad. Agreeing on his side with all that his client said in praise of the charming stranger, young Pedgift appeared to treat the subject, when it fell into his hands, from a different point of view. Miss Gwilt's attractions had not so entirely absorbed his attention as to prevent him from noticing the impression which the new governess had produced on her employer and her pupil. "There's a screw loose somewhere, sir, in Major Milroy's family," said the voice of young Pedgift. "Did you notice how the major and his daughter looked when Miss Gwilt made her excuses for being late at the Mere? You don't remember? Do you remember what Miss Gwilt said?" "Something about Mrs. Milroy, wasn't it?" Allan rejoined. Young Pedgift's voice dropped mysteriously a note lower. "Miss Gwilt reached the cottage this afternoon, sir, at the time when I told you she would reach it, and she would have joined us at the time I told you she would come, but for Mrs. Milroy. Mrs. Milroy sent for her upstairs as soon as she entered the house, and kept her upstairs a good half hour and more. That was Miss Gwilt's excuse, Mr. Armadale, for being late at the Mere." "Well, and what then?" "You seem to forget, sir, what the whole neighborhood has heard about Mrs. Milroy ever since the major first settled among us. We have all been told, on the doctor's own authority, that she is too great a sufferer to see strangers. Isn't it a little odd that she should have suddenly turned out well enough to see Miss Gwilt, in her husband's absence, the moment Miss Gwilt entered the house? Not a bit of it. Of course she was anxious to make acquaintance with her daughter's governess." "Likely enough, Mr. Armadale. But the major and Miss Neelie don't see it in that light, at any rate. I had my eye on them both when the governess told them that Mrs. Milroy had sent for her. If ever I saw a girl look thoroughly frightened, Miss Milroy was that girl; and, if I may be allowed in the strictest confidence to libel a gallant soldier, I should say that the major himself was much in the same condition. Take my word for it, sir, there's something wrong upstairs in that pretty cottage of yours, and Miss Gwilt is mixed up in it already." There was a minute of silence. When the voices were next heard by Midwinter, they were further away from the house. Allan was probably accompanying young Pedgift a few steps on his way back. After a while, Allan's voice was audible once more under the portico, making inquiries after his friend, answered by the servant's voice giving Midwinter's message. This brief interruption over, the silence was not broken again till the time came for shutting up the house. The servant's footsteps passing to and fro, the clang of closing door, the barking of a disturbed dog in the stable-yard, these sounds warned Midwinter it was getting late. He rose mechanically to kindle a light. But his head was giddy, his hand trembled. He laid aside the match-box, and returned to his chair. The conversation between Allan and young Pedgift had ceased to occupy his attention the instant he ceased to hear it, and now again the sense that the precious time was failing him became a lost sense as soon as the house noises which had awakened it had passed away. His energies of body and mind were both alike worn out. He waited with a stolid resignation for the trouble that was to come to him with the coming day. An interval passed, and the silence was once more disturbed by voices outside. The voices of a man and a woman this time. The first few words exchanged between them indicated plainly enough a meeting of the clandestine kind, and revealed the man as one of the servants at Thorpe Ambrose, and the woman as one of the servants at the cottage. Here again, after the first greetings were over, the subject of the new governess became the all-absorbing subject of conversation. The major's servant was brimful of forebodings, inspired solely by Miss Gwilt's good looks, which she poured out irrepressibly on her sweetheart, try as he might to divert her to other topics. Sooner or later, let him mark her words, there would be an awful upset at the cottage. Her master, it might be mentioned in confidence, led a dreadful life with her mistress. The major was the best of men; he hadn't a thought in his heart beyond his daughter and his everlasting clock. But only let a nice-looking woman come near the place, and Mrs. Milroy was jealous of her. Raging jealous, like a woman possessed, on that miserable sick-bed of hers. If Miss Gwilt, who was certainly good-looking in spite of her hideous hair, didn't blow the fire into a flame before many days more were over their heads, the mistress was the mistress no longer, but somebody else. Whatever happened, the fault, this time, would lie at the door of the major's mother. The old lady and the mistress had had a dreadful quarrel 2 years since, and the old lady had gone away in a fury, telling her son before all the servants that, if he had a spark of spirit in him, he would never submit to his wife's temper as he did. It would be too much, perhaps, to accuse the major's mother of purposely picking out a handsome governess to spite the major's wife; but it might be safely said that the old lady was the last person in the world to humor the mistress's jealousy by declining to engage a capable and respectable governess for her granddaughter because that governess happened to be blessed with good looks. How it was all to end, except that it was certain to end badly, no human creature could say. Things were looking as black already as things well could. Miss Neelie was crying after the day's pleasure, which was one bad sign. The mistress had found fault with nobody, which was another. The master had wished her good night through the door, which was a third, and the governess had locked herself up in her room, which was the worst sign of all, for it looked as if she distrusted the servants. Thus the stream of the woman's gossip ran on, and thus it reached Midwinter's ears, through the window, till the clock in the stable-yard struck and stopped the talking. When the last vibrations of the bell had died away, the voices were not audible again, and the silence was broken no more. Another interval passed, and Midwinter made a new effort to rouse himself. This time he kindled the light without hesitation, and took the pen in hand. He wrote at the first trial with a certain facility of expression which, surprising him as he went on, ended in rousing in him some vague suspicion of himself. He left the table and bathed his head and face in water, and came back to read what he had written. The language was barely intelligible, sentences were left unfinished, words were misplaced one for the other. Every line recorded the protest of the weary brain against the merciless will that had forced it into action. Midwinter tore up the sheet of paper as he had torn up the other sheets before it, and, sinking under the struggle at last, laid his weary head on the pillow. Almost on the instant, exhaustion overcame him, and before he could put the light out he fell asleep. He was roused by a noise at the door. The sunlight was pouring into the room, the candle had burned down into the socket, and the servant was waiting outside with a letter which had come for him by the morning's post. "I ventured to disturb you, sir," said the man, when Midwinter opened the door, "because the letter is marked immediate, and I didn't know but it might be of some consequence." Midwinter thanked him and looked at the letter. It was of some consequence; the handwriting was Mr. Brock's. He paused to collect his faculties. The torn sheets of paper on the floor recalled to him in a moment the position in which he stood. He locked the door again, in the fear that Allan might rise earlier than usual and come in to make inquiries. Then, feeling strangely little interest in anything that the rector could write to him now, he opened Mr. Brock's letter and read these lines: "Tuesday. My dear Midwinter, it is sometimes best to tell bad news plainly, in few words. Let me tell mine at once in one sentence. My precautions have all been defeated, the woman has escaped me. This misfortune, for it is nothing less, happened yesterday, Monday. Between 11 and 12 in the forenoon of that day, the business which originally brought me to London obliged me to go to Doctors' Commons, and to leave my servant Robert to watch the house opposite our lodging until my return. About an hour and a half after my departure, he observed an empty cab drawn up at the door of the house. Boxes and bags made their appearance first. They were followed by the woman herself, in the dress I had first seen her in. Having previously secured a cab, Robert traced her to the terminus of a north-western railway, saw her pass through the ticket office, kept her in view till she reached the platform, and there, in the crowd and confusion caused by the starting of a large mixed train, lost her. I must do him the justice to say that he at once took the right course in this emergency. Instead of wasting time in searching for her on the platform, he looked along the line of carriages, and he positively declares that he failed to see her in any one of them. He admits, at the same time, that his search, conducted between 2 o'clock, when he lost sight of her, and 10 minutes past, when the train started, was, in the confusion of the moment, necessarily an imperfect one. But this latter circumstance, in my opinion, matters little. I as firmly disbelieve in the woman's actual departure by that train as if I had searched every one of the carriages myself, and you, I have no doubt, will entirely agree with me. You now know how the disaster happened. Let us not waste time and words in lamenting it. The evil is done, and you and I together must find the way to remedy it. What I have accomplished already, on my side, may be told in 2 words. Any hesitation I might have previously felt at trusting this delicate business in strangers' hands was at an end the moment I heard Robert's news. I went back at once to the city, and placed the whole matter confidentially before my lawyers. The conference was a long one, and when I left the office it was past the post hour, or I should have written to you on Monday instead of writing to-day. My interview with the lawyers was not very encouraging. They warned me plainly that serious difficulties stand in the way of our recovering the lost trace. But they have promised to do their best, and we have decided on the course to be taken, excepting one point on which we totally differ. I must tell you what this difference is, for, while business keeps me away from Thorpe Ambrose, you are the only person whom I can trust to put my convictions to the test. The lawyers are of opinion, then, that the woman has been aware from the first that I was watching her; that there is, consequently, no present hope of her being rash enough to appear personally at Thorpe Ambrose; that any mischief she may have it in contemplation to do will be done in the first instance by deputy; and that the only wise course for Allan's friends and guardians to take is to wait passively till events enlighten them. My own idea is diametrically opposed to this. After what has happened at the railway, I cannot deny that the woman must have discovered that I was watching her. But she has no reason to suppose that she has not succeeded in deceiving me, and I firmly believe she is bold enough to take us by surprise, and to win or force her way into Allan's confidence before we are prepared to prevent her. You, and you only, while I am detained in London, can decide whether I am right or wrong, and you can do it in this way. Ascertain at once whether any woman who is a stranger in the neighborhood has appeared since Monday last at or near Thorpe Ambrose. If any such person has been observed, and nobody escapes observation in the country, take the first opportunity you can get of seeing her, and ask yourself if her face does or does not answer certain plain questions which I am now about to write down for you. You may depend on my accuracy. I saw the woman unveiled on more than one occasion, and the last time through an excellent glass. 1. Is her hair light brown, and apparently not very plentiful? 2. Is her forehead high, narrow, and sloping backward from the brow? 3. Are her eyebrows very faintly marked, and are her eyes small, and nearer dark than light, either gray or hazel? I have not seen her close enough to be certain which. 4. Is her nose aquiline? 5. Are her lips thin, and is the upper lip long? 6. Does her complexion look like an originally fair complexion, which has deteriorated into a dull, sickly paleness? 7. And lastly, has she a retreating chin, and is there on the left side of it a mark of some kind, a mole or a scar, I can't say which? I add nothing about her expression, for you may see her under circumstances which may partially alter it as seen by me. Test her by her features, which no circumstances can change. If there is a stranger in the neighborhood, and if her face answers my 7 questions, you have found the woman. Go instantly, in that case, to the nearest lawyer, and pledge my name and credit for whatever expenses may be incurred in keeping her under inspection night and day. Having done this, take the speediest means of communicating with me, and whether my business is finished or not, I will start for Norfolk by the first train. Always your friend, Decimus Brock. Hardened by the fatalist conviction that now possessed him, Midwinter read the rector's confession of defeat, from the first line to the last, without the slightest betrayal either of interest or surprise. The one part of the letter at which he looked back was the closing part of it. "I owe much to Mr. Brock's kindness," he thought, "and I shall never see Mr. Brock again. It is useless and hopeless, but he asks me to do it, and it shall be done. A moment's look at her will be enough. A moment's look at her with his letter in my hand, and a line to tell him that the woman is here." Again he stood hesitating at the half-opened door. Again the cruel necessity of writing his farewell to Allan stopped him and stared him in the face. He looked aside, doubtingly, at the rector's letter. "I will write the 2 together," he said. "One may help the other." His face flushed deep as the words escaped him. He was conscious of doing what he had not done yet, of voluntarily putting off the evil hour, of making Mr. Brock the pretext for gaining the last respite left, the respite of time. The only sound that reached him through the open door was the sound of Allan stirring noisily in the next room. He stepped at once into the empty corridor, and meeting no one on the stairs, made his way out of the house. The dread that his resolution to leave Allan might fail him if he saw Allan again was as vividly present to his mind in the morning as it had been all through the night. He drew a deep breath of relief as he descended the house steps, relief at having escaped the friendly greeting of the morning from the one human creature whom he loved. He entered the shrubbery with Mr. Brock's letter in his hand, and took the nearest way that led to the major's cottage. Not the slightest recollection was in his mind of the talk which had found its way to his ears during the night. His one reason for determining to see the woman was the reason which the rector had put in his mind. The one remembrance that now guided him to the place in which she lived was the remembrance of Allan's exclamation when he first identified the governess with the figure at the pool. Arrived at the gate of the cottage, he stopped. The thought struck him that he might defeat his own object if he looked at the rector's questions in the woman's presence. Her suspicions would be probably roused, in the first instance, by his asking to see her, as he had determined to ask, with or without an excuse, and the appearance of the letter in his hand might confirm them. She might defeat him by instantly leaving the room. Determined to fix the description in his mind first, and then to confront her, he opened the letter, and, turning away slowly by the side of the house, read the 7 questions which he felt absolutely assured beforehand the woman's face would answer. In the morning quiet of the park slight noises traveled far. A slight noise disturbed Midwinter over the letter. He looked up, and found himself on the brink of a broad grassy trench, having the park on one side and the high laurel hedge of an enclosure on the other. The enclosure evidently surrounded the back garden of the cottage, and the trench was intended to protect it from being damaged by the cattle grazing in the park. Listening carefully as the slight sound which had disturbed him grew fainter, he recognized in it the rustling of women's dresses. A few paces ahead, the trench was crossed by a bridge, closed by a wicket gate, which connected the garden with the park. He passed through the gate, crossed the bridge, and, opening a door at the other end, found himself in a summer-house thickly covered with creepers, and commanding a full view of the garden from end to end. He looked, and saw the figures of two ladies walking slowly away from him toward the cottage. The shorter of the two failed to occupy his attention for an instant. He never stopped to think whether she was or was not the major's daughter. His eyes were riveted on the other figure, the figure that moved over the garden walk with the long, lightly falling dress and the easy, seductive grace. There, presented exactly as he had seen her once already, there, with her back again turned on him, was the woman at the pool. There was a chance that they might take another turn in the garden, a turn back toward the summer-house. On that chance Midwinter waited. No consciousness of the intrusion that he was committing had stopped him at the door of the summer-house, and no consciousness of it troubled him even now. Every finer sensibility in his nature, sinking under the cruel laceration of the past night, had ceased to feel. The dogged resolution to do what he had come to do was the one animating influence left alive in him. He acted, he even looked, as the most stolid man living might have acted and looked in his place. He was self-possessed enough, in the interval of expectation before governess and pupil reached the end of the walk, to open Mr. Brock's letter, and to fortify his memory by a last look at the paragraph which described her face. He was still absorbed over the description when he heard the smooth rustle of the dresses traveling toward him again. Standing in the shadow of the summer-house, he waited while she lessened the distance between them. With her written portrait vividly impressed on his mind, and with the clear light of the morning to help him, his eyes questioned her as she came on, and these were the answers that her face gave him back. The hair in the rector's description was light brown and not plentiful. This woman's hair, superbly luxuriant in its growth, was of the one unpardonably remarkable shade of color which the prejudice of the northern nations never entirely forgives. It was red. The forehead in the rector's description was high, narrow, and sloping backward from the brow. The eyebrows were faintly marked, and the eyes small and in color either gray or hazel. This woman's forehead was low, upright, and broad toward the temples. Her eyebrows, at once strongly and delicately marked, were a shade darker than her hair. Her eyes, large, bright, and well opened, were of that purely blue color, without a tinge in it of gray or green, so often presented to our admiration in pictures and books, so rarely met with in the living face. The nose in the rector's description was aquiline. The line of this woman's nose bent neither outward nor inward. It was the straight, delicately molded nose, with the short upper lip beneath, of the ancient statues and busts. The lips in the rector's description were thin, and the upper lip long. The complexion was of a dull, sickly paleness, the chin retreating, and the mark of a mole or a scar on the left side of it. This woman's lips were full, rich, and sensual. Her complexion was the lovely complexion which accompanies such hair as hers, so delicately bright in its rosier tints, so warmly and softly white in its gentler gradations of color on the forehead and the neck. Her chin, round and dimpled, was pure of the slightest blemish in every part of it, and perfectly in line with her forehead to the end. Nearer and nearer, and fairer she came, in the glow of the morning light. The most startling, the most unanswerable contradiction that eye could see or mind conceive to the description in the rector's letter. Both governess and pupil were close to the summer-house before they looked that way, and noticed Midwinter standing inside. The governess saw him first. "A friend of yours, Miss Milroy?" she asked quietly, without starting or betraying any sign of surprise. Neelie recognized him instantly. Prejudiced against Midwinter by his conduct when his friend had introduced him at the cottage, she now fairly detested him as the unlucky first cause of her misunderstanding with Allan at the picnic. Her face flushed, and she drew back from the summer house with an expression of merciless surprise. "He is a friend of Mr. Armadale's," she replied, sharply. "I don't know what he wants, or why he is here." "A friend of Mr. Armadale's?" The governess's face lighted up with a suddenly roused interest as she repeated the words. She returned Midwinter's look, still steadily fixed on her, with equal steadiness on her side. "For my part," pursued Neelie, resenting Midwinter's insensibility to her presence on the scene, "I think it a great liberty to treat papa's garden as if it were the open park." The governess turned round, and gently interposed. "My dear Miss Milroy," she remonstrated, "there are certain distinctions to be observed. This gentleman is a friend of Mr. Armadale's. You could hardly express yourself more strongly if he was a perfect stranger." "I express my opinion," retorted Neelie, chafing under the satirically indulgent tone in which the governess addressed her. "It's a matter of taste, Miss Gwilt, and tastes differ." She turned away petulantly, and walked back by herself to the cottage. "She is very young," said Miss Gwilt, appealing with a smile to Midwinter's forbearance; "and, as you must see for yourself, sir, she is a spoiled child." She paused, showed, for an instant only, her surprise at Midwinter's strange silence and strange persistency in keeping his eyes still fixed on her, then set herself, with a charming grace and readiness, to help him out of the false position in which he stood. "As you have extended your walk thus far," she resumed, "perhaps you will kindly favor me, on your return, by taking a message to your friend? Mr. Armadale has been so good as to invite me to see the Thorpe Ambrose gardens this morning. Will you say that Major Milroy permits me to accept the invitation, in company with Miss Milroy, between 10 and 11 o'clock?" For a moment her eyes rested, with a renewed look of interest, on Midwinter's face. She waited, still in vain, for an answering word from him, smiled, as if his extraordinary silence amused rather than angered her, and followed her pupil back to the cottage. It was only when the last trace of her had disappeared that Midwinter roused himself, and attempted to realize the position in which he stood. The revelation of her beauty was in no respect answerable for the breathless astonishment which had held him spellbound up to this moment. The one clear impression she had produced on him thus far began and ended with his discovery of the astounding contradiction that her face offered, in one feature after another, to the description in Mr. Brock's letter. All beyond this was vague and misty, a dim consciousness of a tall, elegant woman, and of kind words, modestly and gracefully spoken to him, and nothing more. He advanced a few steps into the garden without knowing why, stopped, glancing hither and thither like a man lost, recognized the summer house by an effort, as if years had elapsed since he had seen it, and made his way out again, at last, into the park. Even here he wandered first in one direction, then in another. His mind was still reeling under the shock that had fallen on it; his perceptions were all confused. Something kept him mechanically in action, walking eagerly without a motive, walking he knew not where. A far less sensitively organized man might have been overwhelmed, as he was overwhelmed now, by the immense, the instantaneous revulsion of feeling which the event of the last few minutes had wrought in his mind. At the memorable instant when he had opened the door of the summer house, no confusing influence troubled his faculties. In all that related to his position toward his friend, he had reached an absolutely definite conclusion by an absolutely definite process of thought. The whole strength of the motive which had driven him into the resolution to part from Allan rooted itself in the belief that he had seen at Hurle Mere the fatal fulfillment of the first vision of the dream. And this belief, in its turn, rested necessarily on the conviction that the woman who was the one survivor of the tragedy in Madeira must be also inevitably the woman whom he had seen standing in the Shadow's place at the pool. Firm in that persuasion, he had himself compared the object of his distrust and of the rector's distrust with the description written by the rector himself, a description carefully minute, by a man entirely trustworthy, and his own eyes had informed him that the woman whom he had seen at the Mere, and the woman whom Mr. Brock had identified in London, were not one, but two. In the place of the dream shadow there had stood, on the evidence of the rector's letter, not the instrument of the fatality, but a stranger. No such doubts as might have troubled a less superstitious man were started in his mind by the discovery that had now opened on him. It never occurred to him to ask himself whether a stranger might not be the appointed instrument of the fatality, now when the letter had persuaded him that a stranger had been revealed as the figure in the dream landscape. No such idea entered or could enter his mind. The one woman whom his superstition dreaded was the woman who had entwined herself with the lives of the two Armadales in the first generation, and with the fortunes of the two Armadales in the second, who was at once the marked object of his father's deathbed warning, and the first cause of the family calamities which had opened Allan's way to the Thorpe Ambrose estate, the woman, in a word, whom he would have known instinctively, but for Mr. Brock's letter, to be the woman whom he had now actually seen. Looking at events as they had just happened, under the influence of the misapprehension into which the rector had innocently misled him, his mind saw and seized its new conclusion instantaneously, acting precisely as it had acted in the pastime of his interview with Mr. Brock at the Isle of Man. Exactly as he had once declared it to be an all-sufficient refutation of the idea of the fatality that he had never met with the timber ship in any of his voyages at sea, so he now seized on the similarly derived conclusion that the whole claim of the dream to a supernatural origin stood self-refuted by the disclosure of a stranger in the shadow's place. Once started from this point, once encouraged to let his love for Allan influence him undividedly again, his mind hurried along the whole resulting chain of thought at lightning speed. If the dream was proved to be no longer a warning from the other world, it followed inevitably that accident, and not fate, had led the way to the night on the wreck, and that all the events which had happened since Allan and he had parted from Mr. Brock were events in themselves harmless, which his superstition had distorted from their proper shape. In less than a moment his mobile imagination had taken him back to the morning at Castletown, when he had revealed to the rector the secret of his name; when he had declared to the rector, with his father's letter before his eyes, the better faith that was in him. Now once more he felt his heart holding firmly by the bond of brotherhood between Allan and himself. Now once more he could say with the eager sincerity of the old time, "If the thought of leaving him breaks my heart, the thought of leaving him is wrong." As that nobler conviction possessed itself again of his mind, quieting the tumult, clearing the confusion within him, the house at Thorpe Ambrose, with Allan on the steps, waiting, looking for him, opened on his eyes through the trees. A sense of illimitable relief lifted his eager spirit high above the cares, and doubts, and fears that had oppressed it so long, and showed him once more the better and brighter future of his early dreams. His eyes filled with tears, and he pressed the rector's letter, in his wild, passionate way, to his lips, as he looked at Allan through the vista of the trees. "But for this morsel of paper," he thought, "my life might have been one long sorrow to me, and my father's crime might have parted us forever." Such was the result of the stratagem which had shown the housemaid's face to Mr. Brock as the face of Miss Gwilt. And so, by shaking Midwinter's trust in his own superstition, in the one case in which that superstition pointed to the truth, did Mother Oldershaw's cunning triumph over difficulties and dangers which had never been contemplated by Mother Oldershaw herself. End of chapter. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Book the Second, Chapter 11 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. 11. Miss Gwilt among the quicksands. 1. From the Reverend Decimus Brock to Ozias Midwinter. Thursday. My dear Midwinter, no words can tell what a relief it was to me to get your letter this morning, and what a happiness I honestly feel in having been thus far proved to be in the wrong. The precautions you have taken in case the woman should still confirm my apprehensions by venturing herself at Thorpe Ambrose seem to me to be all that can be desired. You are, no doubt, sure to hear of her from one or other of the people in the lawyer's office, whom you have asked to inform you of the appearance of a stranger in the town. I am the more pleased at finding how entirely I can trust you in this matter, for I am likely to be obliged to leave Allan's interests longer than I supposed solely in your hands. My visit to Thorpe Ambrose must, I regret to say, be deferred for 2 months. The only one of my brother clergymen in London who is able to take my duty for me cannot make it convenient to remove with his family to Somersetshire before that time. I have no alternative but to finish my business here, and be back at my rectory on Saturday next. If anything happens, you will, of course, instantly communicate with me; and, in that case, be the inconvenience what it may, I must leave home for Thorpe Ambrose. If, on the other hand, all goes more smoothly than my own obstinate apprehensions will allow me to suppose, then Allan, to whom I have written, must not expect to see me till this day 2 months. No result has, up to this time, rewarded our exertions to recover the trace lost at the railway. I will keep my letter open, however, until post time, in case the next few hours bring any news. Always truly yours, Decimus Brock. P.S. I have just heard from the lawyers. They have found out the name the woman passed by in London. If this discovery, not a very important one, I am afraid, suggests any new course of proceeding to you, pray act on it at once. The name is Miss Gwilt. 2. From Miss Gwilt to Mrs. Oldershaw. The Cottage, Thorpe Ambrose, Saturday, June 28. If you will promise not to be alarmed, Mamma Oldershaw, I will begin this letter in a very odd way by copying a page of a letter written by somebody else. You have an excellent memory, and you may not have forgotten that I received a note from Major Milroy's mother, after she had engaged me as governess, on Monday last. It was dated and signed, and here it is as far as the first page. June 23rd, 1851. Dear Madam, pray excuse my troubling you, before you go to Thorpe Ambrose, with a word more about the habits observed in my son's household. When I had the pleasure of seeing you at 2 o'clock to-day, in Kingsdown Crescent, I had another appointment in a distant part of London at 3, and, in the hurry of the moment, 1 or 2 little matters escaped me which I think I ought to impress on your attention. The rest of the letter is not of the slightest importance, but the lines that I have just copied are well worthy of all the attention you can bestow on them. They have saved me from discovery, my dear, before I have been a week in Major Milroy's service. It happened no later than yesterday evening, and it began and ended in this manner. There is a gentleman here, of whom I shall have more to say presently, who is an intimate friend of young Armadale's, and who bears the strange name of Midwinter. He contrived yesterday to speak to me alone in the park. Almost as soon as he opened his lips, I found that my name had been discovered in London, no doubt by the Somersetshire clergyman, and that Mr. Midwinter had been chosen, evidently by the same person, to identify the Miss Gwilt who had vanished from Brompton with the Miss Gwilt who had appeared at Thorpe Ambrose. You foresaw this danger, I remember, but you could scarcely have imagined that the exposure would threaten me so soon. I spare you the details of our conversation to come to the end. Mr. Midwinter put the matter very delicately, declaring, to my great surprise, that he felt quite certain himself that I was not the Miss Gwilt of whom his friend was in search, and that he only acted as he did out of regard to the anxiety of a person whose wishes he was bound to respect. Would I assist him in setting that anxiety completely at rest, as far as I was concerned, by kindly answering one plain question, which he had no other right to ask me than the right my indulgence might give him? The lost Miss Gwilt had been missed on Monday last, at 2 o'clock, in the crowd on the platform of the North Western Railway, in Euston Square. Would I authorize him to say that on that day and at that hour the Miss Gwilt who was Major Milroy's governess had never been near the place? I need hardly tell you that I seized the fine opportunity he had given me of disarming all future suspicion. I took a high tone on the spot, and met him with the old lady's letter. He politely refused to look at it. I insisted on his looking at it. "I don't choose to be mistaken," I said, "for a woman who may be a bad character, because she happens to bear, or to have assumed, the same name as mine. I insist on your reading the first part of this letter for my satisfaction, if not for your own." He was obliged to comply; and there was the proof, in the old lady's handwriting, that, at 2 o'clock on Monday last, she and I were together in Kingsdown Crescent, which any directory would tell him is a crescent in Bayswater. I leave you to imagine his apologies, and the perfect sweetness with which I received them. I might, of course, if I had not preserved the letter, have referred him to you or to the major's mother, with similar results. As it is, the object has been gained without trouble or delay. I have been proved not to be myself; and one of the many dangers that threaten me at Thorpe Ambrose is a danger blown over from this moment. Your housemaid's face may not be a very handsome one, but there is no denying that it has done us excellent service. So much for the past; now for the future. You shall hear how I get on with the people about me, and you shall judge for yourself what the chances are for and against my becoming mistress of Thorpe Ambrose. Let me begin with young Armadale, because it is beginning with good news. I have produced the right impression on him already, and heaven knows that is nothing to boast of. Any moderately good-looking woman who chose to take the trouble could make him fall in love with her. He is a rattle-pated young fool, one of those noisy, rosy, light-haired, good-tempered men whom I particularly detest. I had a whole hour alone with him in a boat the first day I came here, and I have made good use of my time, I can tell you, from that day to this. The only difficulty with him is the difficulty of concealing my own feelings, especially when he turns my dislike of him into downright hatred by sometimes reminding me of his mother. I really never saw a man whom I could use so ill if I had the opportunity. He will give me the opportunity, I believe, if no accident happens, sooner than we calculated on. I have just returned from a party at the great house, in celebration of the rent day dinner, and the squire's attentions to me, and my modest reluctance to receive them, have already excited general remark. My pupil, Miss Milroy, comes next. She, too, is rosy and foolish, and, what is more, awkward and squat and freckled and ill-tempered and ill-dressed. No fear of her, though she hates me like poison, which is a great comfort, for I get rid of her out of lesson time and walking time. It is perfectly easy to see that she has made the most of her opportunities with young Armadale, opportunities, by the by, which we never calculated on, and that she has been stupid enough to let him slip through her fingers. When I tell you that she is obliged, for the sake of appearances, to go with her father and me to the little entertainments at Thorpe Ambrose, and to see how young Armadale admires me, you will understand the kind of place I hold in her affections. She would try me past all endurance if I didn't see that I aggravate her by keeping my temper, so of course I keep it. If I do break out, it will be over our lessons; not over our French, or grammar, history, and globes, but over our music. No words can say how I feel for her poor piano. Half the musical girls in England ought to have their fingers chopped off in the interests of society, and, if I had my way, Miss Milroy's fingers should be executed first. As for the major, I can hardly stand higher in his estimation than I stand already. I am always ready to make his breakfast, and his daughter is not. I can always find things for him when he loses them, and his daughter can't. I never yawn when he proses, and his daughter does. I like the poor dear harmless old gentleman, so I won't say a word more about him. Well, here is a fair prospect for the future, surely? My good Oldershaw, there never was a prospect yet without an ugly place in it. My prospect has 2 ugly places in it. The name of one of them is Mrs. Milroy, and the name of the other is Mr. Midwinter. Mrs. Milroy first. Before I had been 5 minutes in the cottage, on the day of my arrival, what do you think she did? She sent downstairs and asked to see me. The message startled me a little, after hearing from the old lady, in London, that her daughter-in-law was too great a sufferer to see anybody. But of course when I got her message I had no choice but to go upstairs to the sick-room. I found her bedridden, with an incurable spinal complaint, and a really horrible object to look at, but with all her wits about her. And, if I am not greatly mistaken, as deceitful a woman, with as vile a temper, as you could find anywhere in all your long experience. Her excessive politeness, and her keeping her own face in the shade of the bed-curtains while she contrived to keep mine in the light, put me on my guard the moment I entered the room. We were more than half an hour together, without my stepping into any one of the many clever little traps she laid for me. The only mystery in her behavior, which I failed to see through at the time, was her perpetually asking me to bring her things she evidently did not want, from different parts of the room. Since then, events have enlightened me. My first suspicions were raised by overhearing some of the servants' gossip, and I have been confirmed in my opinion by the conduct of Mrs. Milroy's nurse. On the few occasions when I have happened to be alone with the major, the nurse has also happened to want something of her master, and has invariably forgotten to announce her appearance by knocking at the door. Do you understand now why Mrs. Milroy sent for me the moment I got into the house, and what she wanted when she kept me going backward and forward, first for one thing and then for another? There is hardly an attractive light in which my face and figure can be seen, in which that woman's jealous eyes have not studied them already. I am no longer puzzled to know why the father and daughter started and looked at each other when I was first presented to them, or why the servants still stare at me with a mischievous expectation in their eyes when I ring the bell and ask them to do anything. It is useless to disguise the truth, Mother Oldershaw, between you and me. When I went upstairs into that sick room, I marched blindfold into the clutches of a jealous woman. If Mrs. Milroy can turn me out of the house, Mrs. Milroy will; and, morning and night, she has nothing else to do in that bed prison of hers but to find out the way. In this awkward position, my own cautious conduct is admirably seconded by the dear old major's perfect insensibility. His wife's jealousy of him is as monstrous a delusion as any that could be found in a madhouse. It is the growth of her own vile temper, under the aggravation of an incurable illness. The poor man hasn't a thought beyond his mechanical pursuits, and I don't believe he knows at this moment whether I am a handsome woman or not. With this chance to help me, I may hope to set the nurse's intrusions and the mistress's contrivances at defiance, for a time at any rate. But you know what a jealous woman is, and I think I know what Mrs. Milroy is, and I own I shall breathe more freely on the day when young Armadale opens his foolish lips to some purpose, and sets the major advertising for a new governess. Armadale's name reminds me of Armadale's friend. There is more danger threatening in that quarter; and, what is worse, I don't feel half as well armed beforehand against Mr. Midwinter as I do against Mrs. Milroy. Everything about this man is more or less mysterious, which I don't like, to begin with. How does he come to be in the confidence of the Somersetshire clergyman? How much has that clergyman told him? How is it that he was so firmly persuaded, when he spoke to me in the park, that I was not the Miss Gwilt of whom his friend was in search? I haven't the ghost of an answer to give to any of those 3 questions. I can't even discover who he is, or how he and young Armadale first became acquainted. I hate him. No, I don't. I only want to find out about him. He is very young, little and lean, and active and dark, with bright black eyes which say to me plainly, 'We belong to a man with brains in his head and a will of his own, a man who hasn't always been hanging about a country house in attendance on a fool.' Yes, I am positively certain Mr. Midwinter has done something, or suffered something, in his past life, young as he is; and I would give I don't know what to get at it. Don't resent my taking up so much space in my writing about him. He has influence enough over young Armadale to be a very awkward obstacle in my way, unless I can secure his good opinion at starting. Well, you may ask, and what is to prevent your securing his good opinion? I am sadly afraid, Mother Oldershaw, I have got it on terms I never bargained for. I am sadly afraid the man is in love with me already. Don't toss your head and say, 'Just like her vanity.' After the horrors I have gone through, I have no vanity left; and a man who admires me is a man who makes me shudder. There was a time, I own— Pooh! What am I writing? Sentiment, I declare, sentiment to you! Laugh away, my dear. As for me, I neither laugh nor cry. I mend my pen, and get on with my—what do the men call it? My report. The only thing worth inquiring is, whether I am right or wrong in my idea of the impression I have made on him. Let me see. I have been 4 times in his company. The first time was in the major's garden, where we met unexpectedly, face to face. He stood looking at me, like a man petrified, without speaking a word. The effect of my horrid red hair, perhaps? Quite likely. Let us lay it on my hair. The second time was in going over the Thorpe Ambrose grounds, with young Armadale on one side of me, and my pupil, in the sulks, on the other. Out comes Mr. Midwinter to join us, though he had work to do in the steward's office, which he had never been known to neglect on any other occasion. Laziness, possibly? Or an attachment to Miss Milroy? I can't say. We will lay it on Miss Milroy, if you like. I only know he did nothing but look at me. The third time was at the private interview in the park, which I have told you of already. I never saw a man so agitated at putting a delicate question to a woman in my life. But that might have been only awkwardness, and his perpetually looking back after me when we had parted might have been only looking back at the view. Lay it on the view. By all means, lay it on the view. The fourth time was this very evening, at the little party. They made me play, and, as the piano was a good one, I did my best. All the company crowded round me, and paid me their compliments. My charming pupil paid hers with a face like a cat's just before she spits, except Mr. Midwinter. He waited till it was time to go, and then he caught me alone for a moment in the hall. There was just time for him to take my hand and say 2 words. Shall I tell you how he took my hand, and what his voice sounded like when he spoke? Quite needless. You have always told me that the late Mr. Oldershaw doted on you. Just recall the first time he took your hand, and whispered a word or 2 addressed to your private ear. To what did you attribute his behavior that occasion? I have no doubt, if you had been playing on the piano in the course of the evening, you would have attributed it entirely to the music. No, you may take my word for it. The harm is done. This man is no rattle-pated fool, who changes his fancies as readily as he changes his clothes. The fire that lights those big black eyes of his is not an easy fire, when a woman has once kindled it, for that woman to put out. I don't wish to discourage you. I don't say the changes are against us. But with Mrs. Milroy threatening me on one side, and Mr. Midwinter on the other, the worst of all risks to run is the risk of losing time. Young Armadale has hinted already, as well as such a lout can hint, at a private interview. Miss Milroy's eyes are sharp, and the nurse's eyes are sharper, and I shall lose my place if either of them find me out. No matter, I must take my chance, and give him the interview. Only let me get him alone, only let me escape the prying eyes of the women, and, if his friend doesn't come between us, I answer for the result. In the meantime, have I anything more to tell you? Are there any other people in our way at Thorpe Ambrose? Not another creature. None of the resident families call here, young Armadale being, most fortunately, in bad odor in the neighborhood. There are no handsome, highly bred women to come to the house, and no persons of consequence to protest against his attentions to a governess. The only guests he could collect at his party to-night were the lawyer and his family, a wife, a son, and 2 daughters, and a deaf old woman and her son, all perfectly unimportant people, and all obedient humble servants of the stupid young squire. Talking of obedient humble servants, there is one other person established here, who is employed in the steward's office, a miserable, shabby, dilapidated old man, named Bashwood. He is a perfect stranger to me, and I am evidently a perfect stranger to him, for he has been asking the housemaid at the cottage who I am. It is paying no great compliment to myself to confess it, but it is not the less true that I produced the most extraordinary impression on this feeble old creature the first time he saw me. He turned all manner of colors, and stood trembling and staring at me, as if there was something perfectly frightful in my face. I felt quite startled for the moment, for, of all the ways in which men have looked at me, no man ever looked at me in that way before. Did you ever see the boa constrictor fed at the Zoological Gardens? They put a live rabbit into his cage, and there is a moment when the 2 creatures look at each other. I declare Mr. Bashwood reminded me of the rabbit. Why do I mention this? I don't know why. Perhaps I have been writing too long, and my head is beginning to fail me. Perhaps Mr. Bashwood's manner of admiring me strikes my fancy by its novelty. Absurd! I am exciting myself and troubling you about nothing. Oh, what a very long letter I have written, and how brightly the stars look at me through the window, and how awfully quiet the night is! Send me some more of those sleeping drops, and write me one of your nice, wicked, amusing letters. You shall hear from me again as soon as I know a little better how it is all likely to end. Good night, and keep a corner in your stony old heart for L.G. 3. From Mrs. Oldershaw to Miss Gwilt. Diana Street, Pimlico, Monday. My dear Lydia, I am in no state of mind to write you an amusing letter. Your news is very discouraging, and the recklessness of your tone quite alarms me. Consider the money I have already advanced, and the interests we both have at stake. Whatever else you are, don't be reckless, for heaven's sake. What can I do? I ask myself, as a woman of business, what can I do to help you? I can't give you advice, for I am not on the spot, and I don't know how circumstances may alter from one day to another. Situated as we are now, I can only be useful in one way. I can discover a new obstacle that threatens you, and I think I can remove it. You say, with great truth, that there never was a prospect yet without an ugly place in it, and that there are 2 ugly places in your prospect. My dear, there may be 3 ugly places, if I don't bestir myself to prevent it, and the name of the 3rd place will be Brock. Is it possible you can refer, as you have done, to the Somersetshire clergyman, and not see that the progress you make with young Armadale will be, sooner or later, reported to him by young Armadale's friend? Why, now I think of it, you are doubly at the parson's mercy. You are at the mercy of any fresh suspicion which may bring him into the neighborhood himself at a day's notice, and you are at the mercy of his interference the moment he hears that the squire is committing himself with a neighbor's governess. If I can do nothing else, I can keep this additional difficulty out of your way. And oh, Lydia, with what alacrity I shall exert myself, after the manner in which the old wretch insulted me when I told him that pitiable story in the street! I declare I tingle with pleasure at this new prospect of making a fool of Mr. Brock. And how is it to be done? Just as we have done it already, to be sure. He has lost Miss Gwilt, otherwise my housemaid, hasn't he? Very well, he shall find her again, wherever he is now, suddenly settled within easy reach of him. As long as she stops in the place, he will stop in it. And as we know he is not at Thorpe Ambrose, there you are free of him.
The old gentleman's suspicions have given us a great deal of trouble so far. Let us turn them to some profitable account at last. Let us tie him, by his suspicions, to my housemaid's apron string. Most refreshing! Quite a moral retribution, isn't it? The only help I need trouble you for is help you can easily give. Find out from Mr. Midwinter where the parson is now, and let me know by return of post. If he is in London, I will personally assist my housemaid in the necessary mystification of him. If he is anywhere else, I will send her after him, accompanied by a person on whose discretion I can implicitly rely. You shall have the sleeping drops to-morrow. In the meantime, I say at the end what I said at the beginning: no recklessness. Don't encourage poetical feelings by looking at the stars, and don't talk about the night being awfully quiet. There are people in observatories paid to look at the stars for you. Leave it to them. And as for the night, do what Providence intended you to do with the night when Providence provided you with eyelids. Go to sleep in it. Affectionately yours, Maria Oldershaw. 4. From the Reverend Decimus Brock to Ozias Midwinter. Bascombe Rectory, West Somerset, Thursday, July 8. My dear Midwinter, one line before the post goes out, to relieve you of all sense of responsibility at Thorpe Ambrose, and to make my apologies to the lady who lives as governess in Major Milroy's family. The Miss Gwilt, or perhaps I ought to say, the woman calling herself by that name, has, to my unspeakable astonishment, openly made her appearance here, in my own parish. She is staying at the inn, accompanied by a plausible-looking man who passes as her brother. What this audacious proceeding really means, unless it marks a new step in the conspiracy against Allan, taken under new advice, is of course more than I can yet find out. My own idea is, that they have recognized the impossibility of getting at Allan without finding me, or you, as an obstacle in their way, and that they are going to make a virtue of necessity by boldly trying to open their communications through me. The man looks capable of any stretch of audacity, and both he and the woman had the impudence to bow when I met them in the village half an hour since. They have been making inquiries already about Allan's mother here, where her exemplary life may set their closest scrutiny at defiance. If they will only attempt to extort money, as the price of the woman's silence on the subject of poor Mrs. Armadale's conduct in Madeira at the time of her marriage, they will find me well prepared for them beforehand. I have written by this post to my lawyers to send a competent man to assist me, and he will stay at the rectory, in any character which he thinks it safest to assume under present circumstances. You shall hear what happens in the next day or two. Always truly yours, Decimus Brock. End of chapter. Recording by Nadine Nicot-Boulet.